Casanova at Dux, from the Introduction to the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Icy Jumbo. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Casanova at Dux, an unpublished chapter of history by Arthur Symons. Part 1. The Memoirs of Casanova, though they have enjoyed the popularity of a bad reputation, have never had justice done to them by serious students of literature, of life, and of history. One English writer, indeed, Mr. Havelock Ellis, has realized that there are few more delightful books in the world, and he has analysed them in an essay on Casanova, published in Affirmations, with extreme care and remarkable subtlety. But this essay stands alone, at all events in English, as an attempt to take Casanova seriously, to show him in his relation to his time, and in his relation to human problems. And yet these memoirs are perhaps the most valuable document which we possess on the society of the 18th century. They are the history of a unique life, a unique personality, one of the greatest of autobiographies. As a record of adventures, they are more entertaining than Gil Blas, or Monte Cristo, or any of the imaginary travels and escapes and masquerades in life which have been written in imitation of them. They tell the story of a man who loved life passionately for its own sake, one to whom woman was, indeed, the most important thing in the world, but to whom nothing in the world was indifferent. The bust which gives us the most lively notion of him shows us a great, vivid, intellectual face, full of fiery energy and calm resource, the face of a thinker and a fighter in one. A scholar, an adventurer, perhaps a cabalist, a busy stirrer in politics, a gamester, one born of the fairer sex, as he tells us, and born also to be a vagabond. This man, who is remembered now for his written account of his own life, was that rarest kind of autobiographer, one who did not live to write, but wrote because he had lived, and when he could live no longer. And his memoirs take one all over Europe, giving sidelights, all the more valuable in being almost accidental, upon many of the affairs and people most interesting to us during 2/3 of the 18th century. Giacomo Casanova was born in Venice, of Spanish and Italian parentage, on April 2nd, 1725. He died at the chateau of Dux, in Bohemia, on June 4th, 1798. In that lifetime of 73 years, he travelled, as his memoirs show us, in Italy, France, Germany, Austria, England, Switzerland, Belgium, Russia, Poland, Spain, Holland, Turkey. He met Voltaire at Ferney, Rousseau at Montmorency, Fontenelle, d'Alembert and Crébillon at Paris, George III in London, Louis XV at Fontainebleau, Catherine the Great at St. Petersburg, Benedict XII at Rome, Joseph II at Vienna, Frederick the Great at Sans Souci. Imprisoned by the Inquisitor's estate in the Piombi at Venice, he made, in 1755, the most famous escape in history. His memoirs, as we have them, break off abruptly at the moment when he is expecting a safe conduct and the permission to return to Venice after 20 years' wanderings. He did return, as we know from documents in the Venetian archives. He returned as secret agent of the Inquisitors, and remained in their service from 1774 until 1782. At the end of 1782 he left Venice, and next year we find him in Paris, where, in 1784, he met Count Waldstein at the Venetian ambassador's, and was invited by him to become his librarian at Dux. He accepted, and for the 14 remaining years of his life lived at Dux, where he wrote his memoirs. Casanova died in 1798, but nothing was heard of the memoirs, which the Prince de Ligne, in his own memoirs, tells us that Casanova had read to him, and in which he found du diématique, de la rapidité, du comique, de la philosophie, des choses neuves, sublimes, inimitables même, until the year 1820, when a certain Carlo Angiolini brought to the publishing house of Brockhaus, in Leipzig, a manuscript entitled Histoire de ma vie jusqu'à l'an 1797, in the handwriting of Casanova. This manuscript, which I have examined at Leipzig, is written on foolscap paper, rather rough and yellow. It is written on both sides of the page, and in sheets or quires. Here and there the paging shows that some pages have been omitted, and in their place are smaller sheets of thinner and whiter paper, all in Casanova's handsome, unmistakable handwriting. The manuscript is done up in 12 bundles, corresponding with the 12 volumes of the original edition, and only in one place is there a gap. The 4th and 5th chapters of the 12th volume are missing, as the editor of the original edition points out, adding, "It is not probable that these 2 chapters have been withdrawn from the manuscript of Casanova by a strange hand. Everything leads us to believe that the author himself suppressed them, in the intention, no doubt, of rewriting them, but without having found time to do so." The manuscript ends abruptly with the year 1774, and not with the year 1797, as the title would lead us to suppose. This manuscript, in its original state, has never been printed. Herr Brockhaus, on obtaining possession of the manuscript, had it translated into German by Wilhelm Schutz, but with many omissions and alterations, and published this translation, volume by volume, from 1822 to 1828, under the title Aus den Memoiren des Venetianers Jacob Casanova de Seingalt. While the German edition was in course of publication, Herr Brockhaus employed a certain Jean Laforgue, a professor of the French language at Dresden, to revise the original manuscript, correcting Casanova's vigorous, but at times incorrect and somewhat Italian, French, according to his own notions of elegant writing, suppressing passages which seemed too free-spoken from the point of view of morals and of politics, and altering the names of some of the persons referred to, or replacing those names by initials. This revised text was published in 12 volumes, the first 2 in 1826, the 3rd and 4th in 1828, the 5th to the 8th in 1832, and the 9th to the 12th in 1837, the first 4 bearing the imprint of Brockhaus at Leipzig and Pontieu-Essy at Paris, the next 4 the imprint of Heideloff et Camp at Paris, and the last 4 nothing but à Bruxelles. The volumes are all uniform, and were all really printed for the firm of Brockhaus. This, however far from representing the real text, is the only authoritative edition, and my references throughout this article will always be to this edition. In turning over the manuscript at Leipzig, I read some of the suppressed passages, and regretted their suppression. But Herr Brockhaus, the present head of the firm, assured me that they are not really very considerable in number. The damage, however, to the vivacity of the whole narrative, by the persistent alterations of M. Laforgue, is incalculable. I compared many passages, and found scarcely 3 consecutive sentences untouched. Herr Brockhaus, whose courtesy I cannot sufficiently acknowledge, was kind enough to have a passage copied out for me, which I afterwards read over, and checked word by word. In this passage Casanova says, for instance, Elle venoit presque tous les jours lui faire une belle visite. This is altered into Cependant chaque jour Thérèse venait lui faire une visite. Casanova says that someone à voir comme de raison forme le projet d'allier Dieu avec le diable. This is made to read Qui, comme de raison, avait sentiment formé le projet d'allier les intérêts du ciel aux œuvres de ce monde. Casanova tells us that Thérèse would not commit a mortal sin pour devenir reine du monde, pour une couronne, corrects the indefatigable Laforgue. Il ne savoir que lui dire becomes dans cet état de perplexité, and so forth. It must, therefore, be realized that the memoirs, as we have them, are only a kind of pale tracing of the vivid colours of the original. When Casanova's memoirs were first published, doubts were expressed as to their authenticity, first by Ugo Foscolo in the Westminster Review, 1827, then by Quérard, supposed to be an authority in regard to anonymous and pseudonymous writings, finally by Paul Lacroix, le bibliophile Jacob, who suggested, or rather expressed, his certainty that the real author of the memoirs was Stendhal, whose mind, character, ideas, and style he seemed to recognise on every page. This theory, as foolish and as unsupported as the Baconian theory of Shakespeare, has been carelessly accepted, or at all events accepted as possible, by many good scholars who have never taken the trouble to look into the matter for themselves. It was finally disproved by a series of articles of Armand Bachet, entitled Preuves curieuses de l'authenticité des mémoires de Jacques Casanova de Saint-Gall, in Le Livre, January, February, April and May 1881, and these proofs were further corroborated by two articles of Alessandro d'Ancona, entitled Un avventuriere del secolo XVIII, in the Nuovo Antologia, February the 1st and August the 1st, 1882. Bachet had never himself seen the manuscript of the memoir, but he had learnt all the facts about it from Messrs. Brockhaus, and he had himself examined the numerous papers relating to Casanova in the Venetian archives. A similar examination was made at the Frari at the same time by the Abbé Fulin, and I myself, in 1894, not knowing at the time that the discovery had been already made it over again for myself. There the arrest of Casanova, his imprisonment in the Piombi, the exact date of his escape, the name of the monk who accompanied him, are all authenticated by documents contained in the Riferte of the Inquisition of State. There are the bills for the repairs of the roof and walls of the cell from which he escaped. There are the reports of spies on whose information he was arrested, for his too dangerous free-spokenness in matters of religion and morality. The same archives contain 48 letters of Casanova to the Inquisitors of State, dating from 1763 to 1782, among the Riferte dei Confidenti, or the reports of the secret agents, the earliest asking permission to return to Venice, the rest giving information in regard to the immoralities of the city after his return there, all in the same handwriting as the memoirs. Further proof could scarcely be needed, but Bachet has done more than prove the authenticity. He has proved the extraordinary veracity of the memoirs. F. W. Barthold, in Die geschichtlichen Persönlichkeiten in J. Casanova's Memoiren, 2 volumes, 1846, had already examined about 100 of Casanova's allusions to well-known people, showing the perfect exactitude of all but 6 or 7, and out of these 6 or 7 inexactitudes ascribing only a single one to the author's intention. Bachet and d'Ancona both carry on what Barthold had begun. Other investigators in France, Italy, and Germany have followed them, and 2 things are now certain. First, that Casanova himself wrote the memoirs published under his name, though not textually in the precise form in which we have them, and second, that as their veracity becomes more and more evident, they are confronted with more and more independent witnesses. It is only fair to suppose that they are equally truthful where the facts are such as could only have been known to Casanova himself. Section 2. For more than 2/3 of a century, it has been known that Casanova spent the last 14 years of his life at Dux, that he wrote his memoirs there, and that he died there. During all this time people have been discussing the authenticity and the truthfulness of the memoirs. They have been searching for information about Casanova in various directions, and yet hardly anyone has ever taken the trouble or obtained the permission to make a careful examination in precisely the one place where information was most likely to be found. The very existence of the manuscripts at Dux was known only to a few, and to most of these only on hearsay. And thus the singular good fortune was reserved for me, on my visit to Count Waldstein in September 1899, to be the first to discover the most interesting things contained in these manuscripts. Monsieur Octave Utzan, though he had not himself visited Dux, had indeed procured copies of some of the manuscripts, a few of which were published by him in Le Livre in 1887 and 1889. But with the death of Le Livre in 1889, the Casanova Inédit came to an end, and has never, so far as I know, been continued elsewhere. Beyond the publication of these fragments, nothing has been done with the manuscripts at Dux, nor has an account of them ever been given by anyone who has been allowed to examine them. For 5 years, ever since I had discovered the documents in the Venetian archives, I had wanted to go to Dux, and in 1899, when I was staying with Count Lutzow at Zampach in Bohemia, I found the way kindly opened for me. Count Waldstein, the present head of the family, with extreme courtesy, put all his manuscripts at my disposal, and invited me to stay with him. Unluckily, he was called away on the morning of the day that I reached Dux. He had left everything ready for me, and I was shown over the castle by a friend of his, Dr. Kittel, whose courtesy I should like also to acknowledge. After a hurried visit to the castle, we started on the long drive to Oberleutensdorf, a smaller schloss near Komotau, where the Waldstein family was then staying. The air was sharp and bracing. The 2 Russian horses flew like the wind. I was whirled along in an unfamiliar darkness, through a strange country, black with coal mines, through dark pine woods, where a wild peasantry dwelt in little mining towns. Here and there a few men and women passed us on the road in their Sunday finery, then a long space of silence, and we were in the open country, galloping between broad fields, and always in a haze of lovely hills, which I saw more distinctly as we drove back next morning. The return to Dux was like a triumphal entry, as we dashed through the market-place filled with people come for the Monday market, pots and pans and vegetables strewn in heaps all over the ground, on the rough paving stones, up to the great gateway of the castle, leaving but just room for us to drive through their midst. I had the sensation of an enormous building. All Bohemian castles are big, but this one was like a royal palace. Set there in the midst of the town, after the Bohemian fashion, it opens at the back upon great gardens, as if it were in the midst of the country. I walked through room after room, along corridor after corridor. Everywhere there were pictures, everywhere portraits of Wallenstein and battle scenes in which he led on his troops. The library, which was formed, or at least arranged by Casanova, and which remains as he left it, contained some 25,000 volumes, some of them of considerable value. One of the most famous books in Bohemian literature, Scala's History of the Church, exists in manuscript at Dux, and it is from this manuscript that the 2 published volumes of it were printed. The library forms part of the museum, which occupies a ground-floor wing of the castle. The first room is an armoury, in which all kinds of arms are arranged in a decorative way, covering the ceiling and the walls with strange patterns. The second room contains pottery, collected by Casanova's Waldstein on his eastern travels. The third room is full of curious mechanical toys and cabinets and carvings in ivory. Finally, we come to the library, contained in the 2 innermost rooms. The bookshelves are painted white, and reach to the low-vaulted ceilings, which are whitewashed. At the end of a bookcase, in the corner of one of the windows, hangs a fine engraved portrait of Casanova. After I had been all over the castle, so long Casanova's home, I was taken to Count Waldstein's study, and left there with the manuscripts. I found 6 huge cardboard cases, large enough to contain foolscap paper, lettered on the back, Grafle Waldstein-Wartenbergische Real Fideikommiss Dux Oberleutensdorf Handschriftlicher Nachlass Casanova. The cases were arranged so as to stand like books. They opened at the side, and on opening them, one after another, I found series after series of manuscripts, roughly thrown together, after some pretence at arrangement, and lettered with a very generalized description of contents. The greater part of the manuscripts were in Casanova's handwriting, which I could see gradually beginning to get shaky with years. Most were written in French, a certain number in Italian. The beginning of a catalogue in the library, though said to be by him, was not in his handwriting. Perhaps it was taken down at his dictation. There were also some copies of Italian and Latin poems not written by him. Then there were many big bundles of letters addressed to him, dating over more than 30 years. Almost all the rest was in his own handwriting. I came first upon the smaller manuscripts, among which I found, jumbled together on the same and on separate scraps of paper, washing bills, accounts, hotel bills, lists of letters written, first drafts of letters with many erasures, notes on books, theological and mathematical notes, sums, Latin quotations, French and Italian verses with variants, a long list of classical names which have and have not been francisés, with reasons for and against, what I must wear at Dresden, headings without anything to follow, such as Reflections on Respiration, on the True Cause of Youth, the Crows, a new method of winning the lottery at Rome, recipes, among which is a long printed list of perfumes sold at Spa, a newspaper cutting dated Prague, 25th October 1790, on the 37th balloon ascent of Blanchard, thanks to some noble donor for the gift of a dog called Finette, a passport for Monsieur de Casanova, Venetian, allant d'ici en Hollande, October 13th, 1758, ce passeport bon pour 15 jours, together with an order for post horses, gratis, from Paris to Bordeaux and Bayonne. Occasionally one gets a glimpse into his daily life at Dux, as in this note, scribbled on a fragment of paper. Here, and always, I translate the French literally. I beg you to tell my servant what the biscuits are that I like to eat, dipped in wine, to fortify my stomach. I believe that they can all be found at Romans. Usually, however, these notes, though often suggested by something closely personal, branch off into more general considerations, or else begin with general considerations and end with a case in point. Thus, for instance, a fragment of 3 pages begins, "A compliment which is only made to gild the pill is a positive impertinence, and Monsieur Bailly is nothing but a charlatan. The monarch ought to have spit in his face, but the monarch trembled with fear." A manuscript entitled Essai d'égoïsme, dated Dux, this 27th June 1769, contains in the midst of various reflections an offer to let his appartement in return for enough money to tranquillize for 6 months 2 Jew creditors at Prague. Another manuscript is headed Pride and Folly, and begins with a long series of antitheses such as "All fools are not proud, and all proud men are fools. Many fools are happy, all proud men are unhappy." On the same sheet follows this instance or application. Whether it is possible to compose a Latin distich of the greatest beauty without knowing either the Latin language or prosody, we must examine the possibility and the impossibility, and afterwards see who is the man who says he is the author of the distich, for there are extraordinary people in the world. My brother, in short, ought to have composed the distich, because he says so, and because he confided it to me tête-à-tête. I had, it is true, difficulty in believing him, but what is one to do? Either one must believe, or suppose him capable of telling a lie which could only be told by a fool, and that is impossible, for all Europe knows that my brother is not a fool. Here, As so often in these manuscripts, we seem to see Casanova thinking on paper. He uses scraps of paper, sometimes the blank page of a letter, on the other side of which we see the address, as a kind of informal diary, and it is characteristic of him, of the man of infinitely curious mind, which this adventurer really was, that there are so few merely personal notes among these casual jottings. Often they are purely abstract, at times metaphysical jeux d'esprit, like the sheet of 14 different wagers which begins, "I wager that it is not true that a man who weighs 100 pounds will weigh more if you kill him. I wager that if there is any difference he will weigh less. I wager that diamond powder has not sufficient force to kill a man." Side by side with these fanciful excursions into science come more serious ones, as in the note on algebra, which traces its progress since the year 1494, before which it had only arrived at the solution of problems of the second degree inclusive. A scrap of paper tells us that Casanova did not like regular towns. "I like," he says, "Venice, Rome, Florence, Milan, Constantinople, Genoa." Then he becomes abstract and inquisitive again, and writes 2 pages full of curious, out-of-the-way learning on the name of Paradise. The name of Paradise is a name in Genesis which indicates a place of pleasure, lieu voluptueux. This term is Persian. This place of pleasure was made by God before he had created man. It may be remembered that Casanova quarrelled with Voltaire, because Voltaire had told him frankly that his translation of L'Écossaise was a bad translation. It is piquant to read another note written in this style of righteous indignation. "Voltaire, the hardy Voltaire, whose pen is without bit or bridle. Voltaire, who devoured the Bible, and ridiculed our dogmas, doubts, and after having made proselytes to impiety, is not ashamed, being reduced to the extremity of life, to ask for the sacraments, and to cover his body with more relics than Saint Louis had at Amboise." Here is an argument more in keeping with the tone of the Memoirs. "A girl who is pretty and good, and as virtuous as you please, ought not to take it ill that a man, carried away by her charms, should set himself to the task of making their conquest. If this man cannot please her by any means, even if his passion be criminal, she ought never to take offence at it, nor treat him unkindly. She ought to be gentle, and pity him, if she does not love him, and think it enough to keep invincibly hold upon her own duty." Occasionally he touches upon aesthetical matters, as in a fragment which begins with this liberal definition of beauty. "Harmony makes beauty," says Monsieur de S. P., Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, but the definition is too short if he thinks he has said everything. Here is mine. "Remember that the subject is metaphysical. An object really beautiful ought to seem beautiful to all whose eyes fall upon it. That is all. There is nothing more to be said." At times we have an anecdote and its commentary, perhaps jotted down for use in that latter part of the Memoirs which was never written, or which has been lost. Here is a single sheet, dated this 2nd September 1791, and headed Souvenir. "The Prince de Rosenberg said to me, as we went downstairs, that Madame de Rosenberg was dead, and asked me if the Comte de Waldstein had in the library the illustration of the Villa d'Altichiero, which the Emperor had asked for in vain at the City Library of Prague, and when I answered yes, he gave an equivocal laugh. A moment afterwards he asked me if he might tell the Emperor. 'Why not, Monseigneur? It is not a secret. Is His Majesty coming to Dux? If he goes to the Oberleitensdorf, he will go to Dux too, and he may ask you for it, for there is a monument there which relates to him when he was Grand Duke. In that case, His Majesty can also see my critical remarks on the Egyptian prince.' The Emperor asked me this morning, 6th of October, how I employed my time at Dux, and I told him that I was making an Italian anthology. 'You have all the Italians, then?' 'All, sire. See what a lie leads to.' If I had not lied in saying that I was making an anthology, I should not have found myself obliged to lie again in saying that we have all the Italian poets. If the Emperor comes to Dux, I shall kill myself. They say that this Dux is a delightful spot, says Casanova in one of the most personal of his notes, and I see that it might be for many, but not for me, for what delights me in my old age is independent of the place which I inhabit. When I do not sleep, I dream, and when I am tired of dreaming, I blacken paper. Then I read, and most often reject all that my pen has vomited. Here we see him blackening paper on every occasion and for every purpose. In one bundle I found an unfinished story about Roland, and some adventure with women in a cave. Then a meditation on arising from sleep, 19th of May, 1789. Then a short reflection of a philosopher who finds himself thinking of procuring his own death. At Dux, on getting out of bed, on 13th October 1793, day dedicated to St. Lucy, memorable in my too long life. A big budget, containing cryptograms, is headed Grammatical Lottery, and there is the title page of a treatise on the duplication of the hexahedron, demonstrated geometrically to all the universities and all the academies of Europe. See Charles Henry, Les Connaissances Mathématiques de Casanova, Rome, 1883. There are innumerable verses, French and Italian, in all stages, occasionally attaining the finality of these lines, which appear in half a dozen tentative forms. Sans mystère point de plaisir, sans silence point de mystère, charme divin de mes loisirs, solitude que tu m'es chère. Then there are a number of more or less complete manuscripts of some extent. There is the manuscript of the translation of Homer's Iliad in ottava rima, published in Venice 1775-8, of the Histoire de Venise, of the Icosameron, a curious book published in 1787, purporting to be translated from the English, but really an original work of Casanova. Philokalie sur les sottises des mortels, a long manuscript never published. The sketch and beginning of Le Polmarque, ou la calomnie démasquée par la présence d'esprit, tragicomédie en 3 actes, composée à Dux dans le mois de juin de l'année 1791, which recurs again under the form of the Polémoscope, la lorgnette menteuse, ou la calomnie démasquée, acted before the Princesse de Ligne, at her chateau at Töplitz, 1791. There is a treatise in Italian, Delle Passioni. There are long dialogues, such as Le philosophe et le théologien, and Rêve, Dieu moi. There is the Songe d'un quart d'heure, divided into minutes. There is the very lengthy criticism of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre. There is the Confutation d'une censure indiscrète qu'on lit dans la Gazette de Iéna, 19 juin 1789, with another large manuscript, unfortunately imperfect, first called L'Insulte, and then Placé au Public, dated Dux, this 2nd of March 1790, referring to the same criticism on the Icosameron and the Fuite des prisons, l'histoire de ma fuite des prisons de la République de Venise, qu'on appelle les plombes, which is the first draft of the most famous part of the memoirs, and was published at Leipzig in 1788, and, having read it in the Marcian Library at Venice, I am not surprised to learn from this indignant document that it was printed under the care of a young Swiss who had the talent to commit 100 faults of orthography. Section 3. We now come to the documents directly relating to the memoirs, and among these are several attempts at a preface, in which we see the actual preface coming gradually into form. One is entitled Casanova au lecteur, another Histoire de mon existence, and a third Preface. There is also a brief and characteristic Précis de ma vie, dated November the 17th, 1797. Some of these have been printed in Le Livre, 1887. But by far the most important manuscript that I discovered, one which, apparently, I am the first to discover, is a manuscript entitled Extrait du chapitre 4 et 5. It is written on paper similar to that on which the memoirs are written. The pages are numbered 104 to 148, and though it is described as extrait, it seems to contain, at all events, the greater part of the missing chapters to which I have already referred, chapters 4 and 5 of the last volume of the memoirs. In this manuscript we find Armeline and Scholastica, whose story is interrupted by the abrupt ending of chapter 3. We find Mariuccia of volume 7, chapter 9, who married a hairdresser, and we find also Giaconine, whom Casanova recognizes as his daughter, much prettier than Sophia, the daughter of Thérèse Pompiati, whom I had left at London. It is curious that this very important manuscript, which supplies the one missing link in the memoirs, should never have been discovered by any of the very few people who have had the opportunity of looking over the Dux manuscripts. I am inclined to explain it by the fact that the case in which I found this manuscript contains some papers not relating to Casanova. Probably those who looked into this case looked no further. I have told Herr Brockhaus of my discovery, and I hope to see chapters 4 and 5 in their places when the long-looked-for edition of the complete text is at length given to the world. Another manuscript which I found tells with great piquancy the whole story of the Abbé de Brosses's ointment, the curing of the Princess de Conti's pimples, and the birth of the Duc de Montpensier, which is told very briefly, and with much less point, in the Memoirs, Volume 3, page 327. Readers of the Memoirs will remember the duel at Warsaw with Count Branicki in 1766, Volume 10, pages 274 to 320, an affair which attracted a good deal of attention at the time, and of which there is an account in a letter from the Abbé Taruffi to the dramatist Francesco Albergati, dated Warsaw, March the 19th, 1766, quoted in Ernesto Mazzi's Life of Albergati, Bologna, 1878. A manuscript at Dux in Casanova's handwriting gives an account of this duel in the third person. It is entitled Description de l'affaire arrivée à Varsovie le 5 mars 1766. D'Ancona, in the Nuova Antologia, volume 67, page 412, referring to the Abbé Taruffi's account, mentions what he considers to be a slight discrepancy, that Taruffi refers to the danseurs about whom the duel was fought as la Casacci, while Casanova refers to as la Catai. In this manuscript, Casanova always refers to her as la Casacci. La Catai is evidently one of Monsieur Laforgue's arbitrary alterations of the text. In turning over another manuscript, I was caught by the name Charpillon, which every reader of the Memoirs will remember as the name of the harpy by whom Casanova suffered so much in London in 1763-4. This manuscript begins by saying, "I have been in London for 6 months, and have been to see them," that is, the mother and daughter, "in their own house," where he finds nothing but swindlers who cause all who go there to lose their money in gambling. This manuscript adds some details to the story told in the 9th and 10th volumes of the Memoirs, and refers to the meeting with the Charpillons 4.5 years before, described in volume 5, pages 428 to 485. It is written in a tone of great indignation. Elsewhere I found a letter written by Casanova, but not signed, referring to an anonymous letter which he had received in reference to the Charpillons, and ending, "My handwriting is known." It was not until the last that I came upon great bundles of letters addressed to Casanova, and so carefully preserved that little scraps of paper, on which postscripts are written, are still in their places. One sees the seals on the backs of many of the letters, on paper which has slightly yellowed with age, leaving the ink, however, almost always fresh. They come from Venice, Paris, Rome, Prague, Bayreuth, The Hague, Genoa, Fiume, Trieste, etc., and are addressed to as many places, often poste restante. Many are letters from women, some in beautiful handwriting, on thick paper, others on scraps of paper, in painful hands, ill spelt. A countess writes pitifully, imploring help. One protests her love, in spite of the many chagrins he has caused her. Another asks how they are to live together. And another laments that a report has gone about that she is secretly living with him, which may harm his reputation. Some are in French, more in Italian. Mon cher Giacometto, writes one woman, in French. Carissimo a amatissimo, writes another, in Italian. These letters from women are in some confusion, and are in need of a good deal of sorting over and rearranging before their full extent can be realized. Thus I found letters in the same handwriting, separated by letters in other handwritings. Many are unsigned, or signed only by a single initial. Many are undated, or dated only with the day of the week or month. There are a great many letters, dating from 1779 to 1786, signed Francesca Buscini, a name which I cannot identify. They are written in Italian, and one of them begins, Unico mio vero amico, my only true friend. Others are signed Virginia B. One of these is dated Forli, October the 15th, 1773. There is also a Teresa B., who writes from Genoa. I was at first unable to identify the writer of a whole series of letters, in French, very affectionate and intimate letters, usually unsigned, occasionally signed B. She calls herself Votre petite amie, or she ends with a half-smiling, half-reproachful "Good night, and sleep better than I." In one letter, sent from Paris in 1759, she writes, "Never believe me, but when I tell you that I love you, and that I shall love you always." In another letter, ill-spelt, as her letters often are, she writes, "Be assured that evil tongues, vapours, calumny, nothing can change my heart, which is yours entirely, and has no will to change its master." Now it seems to me that these letters must be from Manon Baletti, and that they are the letters referred to in the 6th volume of the Memoirs. We read there, page 60, how on Christmas Day, 1759, Casanova receives a letter from Manon in Paris, announcing her marriage with Monsieur Blondel, architect to the king and member of his academy. She returns him his letters, and begs him to return hers, or burn them. Instead of doing so, he allows Esther to read them, intending to burn them afterwards. Esther begs to be allowed to keep the letters, promising to preserve them religiously all her life. These letters, he says, numbered more than 200, and the shortest were of 4 pages. Certainly there are not 200 of them at Dux, but it seems to me highly probable that Casanova made a final selection from Manon's letters, and it is these which I have found. But, however this may be, I was fortunate enough to find the set of letters which I was most anxious to find, the letters from Henriette, whose loss every writer on Casanova has lamented. Henriette, it will be remembered, makes her first appearance at Cesena in the year 1748. After their meeting at Geneva, she reappears, romantically apropos, 22 years later at Aix-en-Provence, and she writes to Casanova proposing un commerce épistolaire, asking him what he has done since his escape from prison, and promising to do her best to tell him all that has happened to her during the long interval. After quoting her letter, he adds, "I replied to her, accepting the correspondence that she offered me, and telling her briefly all my vicissitudes. She related to me in turn, in some 40 letters, all the history of her life. If she dies before me, I shall add these letters to these memoirs, but today she is still alive, and always happy, though now old." It has never been known what became of these letters, and why they were not added to the memoirs. I have found a great quantity of them, some signed with her married name in full, Henriette de Schnetzmann, and I am inclined to think that she survived Casanova, for one of the letters is dated Bayreuth, 1798, the year of Casanova's death. They are remarkably charming, written with a mixture of piquancy and distinction, and I will quote the characteristic beginning and end of the last letter I was able to find. It begins, "No, it is impossible to be sulky with you," and ends, "If I become vicious, it is you, my mentor, who make me so, and I cast my sins upon you. Even if I were damned, I should still be your most devoted friend, Henriette de Schnetzmann." Casanova was 23 when he met Henriette. Now herself an old woman, she writes to him when he is 73, as if the 50 years that had passed were blotted out in the faithful affection of her memory. How many more discreet and less changing lovers have had the quality of constancy in change, to which this lifelong correspondence bears witness? Does it not suggest a view of Casanova not quite the view of all the world? To me it shows the real man, who perhaps of all others best understood what Shelley meant when he said, "True love in this differs from gold or clay, that to divide is not to take away." But though the letters from women naturally interested me the most, they were only a certain proportion of the great mass of correspondence which I turned over. There were letters from Carlo Angiolini, who was afterwards to bring the manuscript of the memoirs to Brockhaus; from Balbi, the monk with whom Casanova escaped from the Piombi; from the Marquis Albergati, playwright, actor, and eccentric, of whom there is some account in the memoirs; from the Marquis Mosca, a distinguished man of letters whom I was anxious to see, Casanova tells us in the same volume in which he describes his visit to the Moscas at Pesaro; from Zulian, the brother of the Duchess of Fiano; from Richard Lorraine, bel homme, ayant de l'esprit, le temps et le goût de la bonne société, who came to settle at Gorizia in 1773, while Casanova was there; from the procurator Morosini, whom he speaks of in the memoirs as his protector, and as one of those through whom he obtained permission to return to Venice. His other protector, the Avogado Zaguri, had, says Casanova, since the affair of the Marquis Albergati, carried on a most interesting correspondence with me, and in fact I found a bundle of no less than 138 letters from him, dating from 1784 to 1798. Another bundle contains 172 letters from Count Lambert. In the memoirs Casanova says, referring to his visit at Augsburg at the end of 1761, "I used to spend my evenings in a very agreeable manner at the house of Count Max de Lambert, who resided at the court of the Prince Bishop with the title of Grand Marshal. What particularly attached me to Count Lambert was his literary talent. A first-rate scholar, learned to a degree, he has published several much-esteemed works. I carried on an exchange of letters with him, which ended only with his death 4 years ago in 1792. Casanova tells us that, at his second visit to Augsburg, in the early part of 1767, he supped with Count Lambert 2 or 3 times a week during the 4 months he was there. It is with this year that the letters I have found begin. They end with the year of his death, 1792. In his Mémorial d'un mondain, Lambert refers to Casanova as a man known in literature, a man of profound knowledge. In the first edition of 1774, he laments that a man such as Monsieur de S. Galt should not yet have been taken back into favour by the Venetian government, and in the second edition, 1775, rejoices over Casanova's return to Venice. Then there are letters from Da Ponte, who tells the story of Casanova's curious relations with Madame d'Urfe in his Memorie scritte da esso, 1829. From Pittone, Bonno, and others mentioned in different parts of the memoirs, and from some dozen others who are not mentioned in them. The only letters in the whole collection that have been published are those from the Prince de Ligne and from Count Koenig. Section 4. Casanova tells us in his memoirs that, during his later years at Dux, he had only been able to hinder black melancholy from devouring his poor existence or sending him out of his mind by writing 10 or 12 hours a day. The copious manuscripts at Dux show us how persistently he was at work on a singular variety of subjects, in addition to the memoirs, and to the various books which he published during those years. We see him jotting down everything that comes into his head, for his own amusement, and certainly without any thought of publication, engaging in learned controversies, writing treatises on abstruse mathematical problems, composing comedies to be acted before Count Waldstein's neighbours, practising verse writing in 2 languages, indeed with more patience than success, writing philosophical dialogues in which God and himself are the speakers, and keeping up an extensive correspondence both with distinguished men and with delightful women. His mental activity, up to the age of 73, is as prodigious as the activity which he had expended in living a multiform and incalculable life. As in life, everything living had interested him, so in his retirement from life every idea makes its separate appeal to him, and he welcomes ideas with the same impartiality with which he had welcomed adventures. Passion has intellectualized itself, and remains not less passionate. He wishes to do everything, to compete with everyone, and it is only after having spent 7 years in heaping up miscellaneous learning and exercising his faculties in many directions that he turns to look back over his own past life and to live it over again in memory as he writes down the narrative of what had interested him most in it. I write in the hope that my history will never see the broad daylight of publication, he tells us, scarcely meaning it, we may be sure, even in the moment of hesitancy which may naturally come to him. But if ever a book was written for the pleasure of writing it, it was this one, and an autobiography written for oneself is not likely to be anything but frank. Truth is the only God I have ever adored, he tells us, and we now know how truthful he was in saying so. I have only summarized in this article the most important confirmations of his exact accuracy in facts and dates. The number could be extended indefinitely. In the manuscripts we find innumerable further confirmations, and their chief value as testimony is that they tell us nothing which we should not already have known if we had merely taken Casanova at his word. But it is not always easy to take people at their own word when they are writing about themselves, and the world has been very loath to believe in Casanova as he represents himself. It has been specially loath to believe that he is telling the truth when he tells us about his adventures with women. But the letters contained among these manuscripts show us the women of Casanova writing to him with all the fervour and all the fidelity which he attributes to them, and they show him to us in the character of as fervid and faithful a lover. In every fact, every detail, and in the whole mental impression which they convey, these manuscripts bring before us the Casanova of the memoirs. As I seemed to come upon Casanova at home, it was as if I came upon old friend, already perfectly known to me, before I had made my pilgrimage to Dux. 1902. End of Casanova at Dux. Recording by Icy Jumbo.
Translator's Preface. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melody Martinez. Translator's Preface. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Translator's Preface. A series of adventures wilder and more fantastic than the wildest of romances. written down with the exactitude of a business diary, a view of men and cities, from Naples to Berlin, from Madrid and London to Constantinople and St. Petersburg, the Vientine of the 18th century depicted by a man who today sat with cardinals and saluted crowned heads, and tomorrow lurked in dens of profligacy and crime. A book of confessions penned without reticence and without penitence. A record of 40 years of occult charlatanism. A collection of tales of successful imposture, of bonne fortune, of marvelous escapes, of transcendent audacity, told with the humor of Smollett and the delicate wit of Voltaire. Who is there interested in men and letters, and in the life of the past, who would not cry, "Where can such a book as this be found?" Yet the above catalogue is but a brief outline, a bare and meagre summary, of the book known as the Memoirs of Casanova, a work absolutely unique in literature. He who opens these wonderful pages is as one who sits in a theatre and looks across the gloom, not on a stage play, but on another and a vanished world. The curtain draws up, and suddenly 150 years are rolled away, and in bright light stands out before us the whole life of the past, the gay dresses, the polished wit, the careless morals, and all the revel and dancing of those merry years before the mighty deluge of the Revolution. The palaces and marble stairs of old Venice are no longer desolate, but thronged with scarlet-robed senators. Prisoners with the doom of the Ten upon their heads cross the Bridge of Sighs. At dead of night the nun slips out of the convent gate to the dark canal where a gondola is waiting. We assist at the party's fines of cardinals, and we see the bank made at faro. Venice gives place to the assembly rooms of Mrs. Cornely, and the fast taverns of the London of 1760. We pass from Versailles to the winter palace of St. Petersburg in the day of Catherine, from the policy of the great Frederick to the lewd mirth of the strolling players, and the presence chamber of the Vatican is succeeded by an intrigue in a garret. It is indeed a new experience to read this history of a man who, refraining from nothing, has concealed nothing, of one who stood in the courts of Louis the Magnificent before Madame de Pompadour, and of the nobles of the ancien régime, and had an affair with an adventuress of Denmark Street, Soho, and was bound over to keep the peace by Fielding, and knew Cagliostro, the friend of popes and kings and noblemen, and of all the male and female ruffians and vagabonds of Europe, abbé, soldier, charlatan, gamester, financier, diplomatist, viveur, philosopher, virtuoso, chemist, fiddler, and buffoon. Each of these, and all of these, was Giacomo Casanova, Chevalier de Seingalt, Knight of the Golden Spur. And not only are the memoirs a literary curiosity, they are almost equally curious from a bibliographical point of view. The manuscript was written in French and came into the possession of the publisher Brockhaus of Leipzig, who had it translated into German and printed. From this German edition M. Aubert de Vitry retranslated the work into French, but omitted about a fourth of the matter, and this mutilated and worthless version is frequently purchased by unwary bibliophiles. In the year 1826, however, Brockhaus, in order presumably to protect his property, printed the entire text of the original manuscript in French, for the first time, and in this complete form, containing a large number of anecdotes and incidents not to be found in the spurious version. The work was not acceptable to the authorities, and was consequently rigorously suppressed. Only a few copies sent out for presentation or for review are known to have escaped. and from one of these rare copies the present translation has been made, and solely for private circulation. In conclusion, both translator and editor have done their utmost to present the English Casanova in a dress worthy of the wonderful and witty original. End of translator's preface.
Author's Preface of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashwin Jain. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Author's Preface. I will begin with this confession. Whatever I have done in the course of my life, whether it be good or evil, has been done freely. I am a free agent. The doctrine of the Stoics, or of any other sect as to the force of destiny, is a bubble engendered by the imagination of man, and is near akin to atheism. I not only believe in one God, but my faith as a Christian is also grafted upon that tree of philosophy, which has never spoiled anything. I believe in the existence of an immaterial God, the author and master of all beings and all things, and I feel that I never had any doubt of his existence, from the fact that I have always relied upon his providence, prayed to him in my distress, and that he has always granted my prayers. Despair brings death, but prayer does away with despair. And when a man has prayed, he feels himself employed by the sovereign master of human beings to avoid impending dangers from those who beseech his assistance. I confess that the knowledge of them is above the intelligence of man, who can but wonder and adore. Our ignorance becomes our only resource, and happy, truly happy, are those who cherish their ignorance. Therefore must we pray to God and believe that he has granted the favor we have been praying for, even when in appearance it seems the reverse. As to the position which our body ought to assume when we address ourselves to the Creator, a line of Petrarch settles it. Con le ginocchia della mente incline. Man is free, but his freedom ceases when he has no faith in it, and the greater power he ascribes to faith, the more he deprives himself of that power which God has given to him when he endowed him with the gift of reason. Reason is a particle of the Creator's divinity. When we use it with a spirit of humility and justice, we are certain to please the giver of that precious gift. God ceases to be God only for those who can admit the possibility of his non-existence, and that conception is in itself the most severe punishment they can suffer. Man is free, yet we must not suppose that he is at the liberty to do everything he pleases, for he becomes a slave the moment he allows his actions to be ruled by passion. The man with sufficient power over himself to wait until his nature has recovered its even balance is a truly wise man, but such beings are seldom met with. The reader of these memoirs will discover that I have never had any fixed aim before my eyes, and that my system, if it can be called a system, has been to glide away unconcernedly on the stream of life, trusting to the wind wherever it led. How many changes arise from such an independent mode of life? My success and my misfortunes, the bright and the dark days I have gone through, Everything has provided to me that in this world, either physical or moral, good comes out of evil just as well as evil comes out of good. My errors will point to thinking men the various roads, and will teach them the great art of treading on the brink of the precipice without falling into it. It is only necessary to have courage, for strength without self-confidence is useless. I have often met with happiness after some imprudent step which ought to have brought ruin upon me, and although passing a vote of censure upon myself, I would thank God for His mercy. But, by way of compensation, dire misfortune has befallen me in consequence of actions prompted by the most cautious wisdom. This would humble me, yet conscious that I had acted rightfully, I would easily derive comfort from that conviction. In spite of a good foundation of sound morals, the nature offspring of the divine principles which have been early rooted in my heart, I have been, throughout my life, the victim of my senses. I have found delight in losing the right path. I have constantly lived in a mist of error, with no consolation but the consciousness of my being mistaken. Therefore, dear reader, I trust that, far from attaching to my history the character of impudent boasting, you will find in my memoirs only the characteristic proper to a general confession, and that my narratory style will be the manner neither of a repenting sinner nor of a man ashamed to acknowledge his frolics. They are the follies inherent to youth. I make sport of them, and, if you are kind, you will not yourself refuse them a good-natured smile. You will be amused when you see that I have more than once deceived without the slightest qualm of conscience, both knaves and fools, and to the deceit perpetrated upon women, let it pass, for when love is in the way, men and women in general will dupe each other. But on the score of fools, it is a very different matter. I always feel the greatest bliss when I recollect those I have caught in my snares, for they generally are insolent, and so self-conceited that they challenge wit. We avenge intellect when we dupe a fool, and it is a victory not to be despised, for a fool is covered with steel, and it is often very hard to find his vulnerable part. In fact, to gull a fool seems to me an exploit worthy of a witty man. I have felt in my very blood, ever since I was born, a most unconquerable hatred towards the whole tribe of fools, and it arises from the fact that I feel myself a blockhead whenever I am in their company. I am very far from placing them in the same class with those men whom we call stupid, for the latter are stupid only from deficient education, and I rather like them. I have met with some of them very honest fellows, who, with all their stupidity, have a kind of intelligence and an upright good sense, which cannot be the characteristics of fools. They are like eyes veiled with a cataract, which, if the disease could be removed, would be very beautiful. Dear reader, examine the spirit of this preface, and you will at once guess at my purpose. I have written a preface because I wish you to know me thoroughly before you begin the reading of my memoirs. It is only in a coffee room or at a table d'hôte that we like to converse with strangers. I have written the history of my life, and I have a perfect right to do so. But am I wise in throwing it before a public of which I know nothing but evil? No, I am aware it is sheer folly, but I want to be busy, I want to laugh, and why should I deny myself this gratification? Expulit elaboro morbum bellem Q mero. An ancient author tells us somewhere, with the tone of a pedagogue, if you have ever not done anything worthy of being recorded, at least write something worthy of being read. It is a percept as beautiful as a diamond of the first water cut in England, but cannot be applied to me because I have not written either a novel or the life of an illustrious character. Worthy or not, my life is my subject, and my subject is my life. I have lived without dreaming that I should ever take a fancy to write the history of my life, and for that very reason, my memoirs claim from the reader an interest and a sympathy which they would not have obtained had I always entertained the design to write them in my own age, and, still more, to publish them. I have reached, in 1797, the age of 80 years and 12. I cannot say vixi, and I could not procure a more agreeable pastime than to relate my own adventures and to cause pleasant laughter amongst the good company listening to me, from which I have received so many tokens of friendship, in the midst of which I have ever lived. To enable me to write well, I have only to think that my readers will belong to that polite society. Q sanc dixi, si resurrent, dictavet auditor. Should there be a few intruders whom I cannot prevent from pursuing my memoirs, I must find comfort in the idea that my history was not written for them. By recollecting the pleasures I have had formerly, I renew them. I enjoy them a second time, while I laugh at the remembrance of troubles now past, and which I no longer feel. A member of this great universe, I speak to the air, and I fancy myself rendering an account of my administration, as a steward is wont to do before leaving the situation. For my future I have no concern, and as a true philosopher I never would have any, for I know not what it may be. As a Christian, on the other hand, faith must believe without discussion, and the stronger it is, the more it keeps silent. I know that I have lived because I have felt, and feeling giving me the knowledge of my existence. I know likewise that I shall exist no more when I shall have ceased to feel. Should I perchance still feel after my death, I would no longer have any doubt, but I would most certainly give it the lie to anyone asserting before me that I was dead. The history of my life must begin by the earliest circumstance which my memory can evoke. It will therefore commence when I had attained the age of 8 years and 4 months. Before that time, if to think is to live to be a true axiom, I did not live. I could only lay claim to a state of vegetation. The mind of a human being is formed only of comparisons made in order to examine analogies, and therefore cannot precede the existence of memory. The mnemonic organ was developed in my head only 8 years and 4 months after my birth, It is then that my soul began to be susceptible of receiving impressions. How is it possible for an immaterial substance which can neither touch nor be touched to receive impressions? It is a mystery which man cannot unravel. A certain philosophy, full of consolation and in perfect accord with religion, pretends that the state of dependence in which the soul stands in relation to the senses and to the organs is only incidental and transient, and that it will reach a condition of freedom and happiness when the death of the body shall have delivered it from the state of tyrannic subjection. This is very fine, but apart from religion, which is the proof of it all, therefore, as I cannot, from my own information, have a perfect certainty of my being immortal until the dissolution of my body has actually taken place, people must kindly bear with me, if I am in no hurry to obtain that certain knowledge, for, in my estimation, a knowledge to be gained at the cost of life is a rather expensive piece of information. In the meantime, I worship God, laying every wrong action under an interdict which I endeavour to respect, and I loathe the wicked without doing them any injury. I only abstain from doing them any good, in the full belief that we ought not to cherish serpents. As I must likewise say a few words respecting my nature and my temperament, I premise the most indulgent of my readers is not likely to be the most dishonest or the least gifted with intelligence. I have had, in turn, every temperament, phlegmatic in my infancy, sanguine in my youth, later on, bilious, and now I have a disposition which engenders melancholy, and most likely will never change. I always made my food congenial to my constitution, and my health was always excellent. I learned very early that our health is always impaired by some excess either of food or abstinence, and I never had any physician except myself. I am bound to add that the excess in too little has ever proved in me more dangerous than the excess in too much. The last may cause indigestion, but the first causes death. Now, old as I am, and although enjoying good digestive organs, I must have only one meal every day, but I find a set off to the privation in my delightful sleep, and in the ease which I experience in writing down my thoughts without having recourse to paradox or sophism, which would be calculated to deceive myself even more than my readers. For I never could make up my mind to palm counterfeit coin upon them if I knew it to be such. The sanguine temperament rendered me very sensible to the attractions of voluptuousness. I always very cheerful and ever ready to pass from one enjoyment to another, and I was at the same time very skilful in inventing new pleasures. Thence, I suppose, my natural disposition to make fresh acquaintances and to break with them so readily, although always for a good reason, and never through mere fickleness. The errors caused by temperament are not to be corrected, because our temperament is perfectly independent of our strength. It is not the case with our character. Heart and head are the constituent parts of the character, temperament has almost nothing to do with it, and therefore character is dependent on education and is susceptible of being corrected and improved. I leave to others the decision as to the good or evil tendencies of my character, but such as it is, it shines upon my countenance, and there it can be easily detected by any physiognomist. It is only on the fact that character can be read. There it lies exposed to the view. It is worthy of remark that men who have no peculiar cast of countenance, and there are a great many of such men, are likewise totally deficient in peculiar characteristics, and we may establish the rule that the varieties in physiognomy are equal to the differences in character. I am aware that throughout my life my actions have received their impulse more from the force of feeling than from the wisdom of reason, and this has led me to acknowledge that my conduct has been dependent upon my nature more than upon my mind. Both are generally at war. In the midst of their continual collisions, I have never found in me sufficient mind to balance my nature, or enough strength in my nature to counteract the power of my mind. But enough of this, for there is truth in the old saying, Si brevis esse volo, obscurus fiu, and I believe that, without offending against modesty, I can apply to myself the following words of my dear Virgil. Nexum adeo in formis, nuper me in lectore vidi, cum placidum ventis terret mare. The chief business of my life has always been to indulge my senses. I never knew anything of great importance. I felt myself born for the fair sex. I have ever loved it dearly, and I have been loved by it as often as much as I could. I have likewise always had a great weakness for good living, and I ever felt passionately fond of every object which excited my curiosity. I have had friends who have acted kindly towards me, and it has been my good fortune to have it in my power to give them substantial proofs of my gratitude. I have had also bitter enemies who have persecuted me, and whom I have not crushed simply because I could not do it. I never would have forgiven them had I not lost the memory of all the injuries they had heaped upon me. The man who forgets does not forgive. He only loses the remembrance of the harm inflicted on him. Forgiveness is the offspring of a feeling of heroism, of a noble heart, of a generous mind, whilst forgetfulness is only the result of a weak memory, or of an easy carelessness, and still oftener of a natural desire for calm and quietness. Hatred, in the course of time, kills the unhappy wretch who delights in nursing it in his bosom. Should anyone bring against me an accusation of sensuality, it would be wrong. For all the fierceness of my senses never caused me to neglect any of my duties. For the same excellent reason, the accusation of drunkenness ought not to be brought against Homer. Laudibus argutur vini vinosus Homerus. I have always been fond of highly seasoned, rich dishes, such as Marconi prepared by a skillful Neapolitan cook, and the olla podrida of Spaniards, the gluttonous codfish from Newfoundland, game with a strong flavor, and cheese, the perfect state of which is attained when the tiny immaculate, formed with its very essence, begin to shew signs of life. As for women, I have always found the odor of my beloved ones exceeding pleasant. What depraved taste! Some people will exclaim, are you not ashamed to confess such inclinations without blushing? My dear critics, you make me laugh heartily. Thanks to my coarse taste, I believe myself happier than other men, because I am convinced that they enhance my enjoyment. Happy are those who know how to obtain pleasures without injury to anyone. Insane are those who fancy that the Almighty can enjoy the sufferings, the pains, the fasts and abstinences which they tax themselves so foolishly. God can only demand from His creatures the practice of virtues, the seed of which He has sown in their soul, and all He has given unto us has been intended for our happiness, self-love, thirst for praise, emulation, strength, courage, and a power of which nothing can deprive us, the power of self-destruction. If, after due calculation, whether false or just, we unfortunately reckon death to be advantageous, this is the strongest proof of our moral freedom, so much attacked by sophists. Yet this power of self-destruction is repugnant to nature and has been rightly opposed by every religion. A so-called freethinker told me at one time that I could not consider myself a philosopher if I have placed any faith in revelation. But when we accept it readily in physics, why should we reject it in religious matters? The form alone is the point in question. The spirit speaks to the spirit, and not to the ears. The principles of everything we are acquainted with must necessarily have been revealed to those from whom we have received them by the great, supreme principle which contains them all. The bee erecting its hive, the swallow building its nest, the ant constructing its cave, and the spider warping its web, would never have done anything but for a previous and everlasting revelation. We must either believe that it is so, or admit that the matter is endowed with thought. But as we dare not pay such a compliment to matter, let us stand by revelation. The great philosopher, who having deeply studied nature, thought that he had found the truth, because he acknowledged nature as God, died too soon. Had he lived a little while longer, he would have gone much farther, and yet his journey would have been a short one. For finding himself in his author, he could not have denied him. In short, we move and have our being. He would have found him inscrutable, and thus would have ended his journey. God, great principle of all minor principles, God, who is himself without a principle, could not conceive himself, if, in order to do it, he required to know his own principle. A blissful ignorance, Spinoza, the virtuous Spinoza, died before he could possess it. He would have died a learned man, and with a right to the reward his virtue deserved, if he had only supposed his soul to be immortal. It is not true that a wish for reward is unworthy of real virtue, and throws a blemish upon its purity. Such a pretension, on the contrary, helps to sustain virtue. man being himself too weak to consent to be virtuous only for his own gratification. I hold as a myth that amphiarus who prefer to be good than to seem good. In fact, I do not believe there is an honest man alive without some pretension. And here is mine. I pretend to the friendship, to the esteem, to the gratitude of my readers. I claim their gratitude, if memoirs can give them instruction and pleasure. I claim their esteem if, rendering me justice, they find more good qualities in me than faults. And I claim their friendship as soon as they deem me worthy of it, by the candor and the good faith with which I abandon myself to their judgment, without disguise, and exactly as I am in reality. They will find that I have always had sincere love for truth, that I have often begun by telling stories for the purpose of getting truth to enter the heads of those who could not appreciate its charms. They will not form a wrong opinion of me when they see one emptying purse of my friends to satisfy my fancies. For those friends entertained idle schemes, and by giving them the hope of success, I trusted to disappointment to cure them. I would deceive them to make them wiser, and I did not consider myself guilty, for I applied to my own enjoyment sums of money which would have been lost in the vain pursuit of possessions denied by nature. Therefore, I was not actuated by the avaricious rapacity. I might think myself guilty if I were rich now, but I have nothing. I have squandered everything. It is my comfort and my justification. The money was intended for extravagant follies, and by applying it to my own frolics, I did not turn it into a very different channel. If I were deceived in my hope to please, I candidly confess I would regret it, but not sufficiently so to repent having returned my memoirs, for, after all, writing them has given me pleasure. O cruel ennui! It must be by mistake that those who have invented the torments of hell have forgotten to ascribe thee the first place among them. Yet I am bound to own that I entertain a great fear of hisses. It is too natural a fear for me to boast of being insensible to them, and I cannot find any solace in the idea that, when these memoirs are published, I shall be no more. I cannot think without a shudder of contracting any obligation towards death. I hate death, for, happy or miserable, life is the only blessing which man possesses, and those who do not love it are unworthy of it. If we prefer honor to life, it is because life is blighted by infamy, and if, in the alternative, man sometimes throws away his life, philosophy must remain silent. Oh, death, cruel death, fatal law which nature necessarily rejects because thy very office is to destroy nature. Cicero says that death frees us from all pains and sorrows, but this great philosopher books all the expense without taking the receipts into account. I do not recollect if, when he wrote his Tusculan Disputations, his own Tullia was dead. Death is a monster which turns away from the great theatre an attentive hearer before the end of the play, which deeply interests him, and this is reason enough to hate it. All my adventures are not to be found in these memoirs. I have left out those which might have offended the persons who have played a sorrow part therein. In spite of this reserve, my readers will perhaps often think me indiscreet, and I am sorry for it. Should I perchance become wiser before I give up the ghost, I might burn every one of these sheets, but now I have not courage enough to do it. It may be that certain love scenes will be considered too explicit, but let no one blame me, unless it be for lack of skill, for I ought not to be scolded because, in my old age, I can find no other enjoyment but that which recollections of the past afforded me. After all, virtuous and prudish readers are at liberty to skip over any offensive pictures, and I think it my duty to give them this piece of advice, so much the worse for those who may not read my preface. It is no fault of mine if they do not, for everyone ought to know that a preface is to a book what a playbill is to a comedy. Both must be read. My memoirs are not written for young persons who, in order to avoid false steps and slippery roads, ought to spend their youth in blissful ignorance, but for those who, having thorough experience of life, are no longer exposed to temptation, and who, having but too often gone through the fire, are like salamanders, and can be scorched by it no more. True virtue is but a habit, and I have no hesitation in saying that the really virtuous are those persons who can practice virtue without the slightest trouble. Such persons are always full of toleration, and it is to them that my memoirs are addressed. I have written in French and not in Italian, because the French language is more universal than mine, and the purists who may criticize in my style some Italian turns will be quite right, but only in case it should prevent them from understanding me clearly. The Greeks admired Theophrastus in spite of his Eurasian style, and the Romans delighted in their Livy in spite of his paternity. Provided I amuse my readers, it seems to me that I can claim the same indulgence. After all, every Italian reads Algarotti with pleasure, although his works are full of French idioms. There is one thing worthy of notice. Of all the living languages belonging to the Republic of Letters, the French tongue is the only one which has been condemned by its masters never to borrow in order to become richer, whilst all other languages, although richer in words than the French, plunder from it words and constructions of sentences, whenever they find that by such robbery they add something to their own beauty. Yet those who borrow the most from the French are the most forward in trumpeting the poverty of that language, very likely thinking that such an accusation justifies their depredations. It is said that the French language has attained the apogee of its beauty, and that the smallest foreign loan would spoil it. But I make bold to assert that this is prejudice, for although it certainly is the most clear, the most logical of all languages, it would be great temerity to affirm that it can never go farther or higher than it has gone. We all recollect that in the days of Lully there was but one opinion of music, yet Rameau came and everything was changed. The new impulse given to the French nation may open new and unexpected horizons, and new beauties, fresh perfections may spring up from new combinations and from new wants. The motto I have adopted justifies my discretions, and all the commentaries, perhaps too numerous, in which I indulge upon my various exploits, nequidquam sapit qui sibi non sapit. For the same reason, I have always felt a great desire to receive praise and applause from polite society. Excitat auditor statim, lauditic virtus, crescit et immensum gloria calcar habet. I would willingly have displayed here the proud axiom, nemo le editur nisi esse ipso, had I not feared to offend the immense number of persons who, whenever anything goes wrong with them, are wont to exclaim, "It is no fault of mine." I cannot deprive them of that small particle of comfort, for, were it not for it, they would soon feel hatred for themselves, and self-hatred often leads to the fatal idea of self-destruction. As for myself, I always willingly acknowledge my own self as a principal cause of every good or of every evil which may befall me. Therefore, I have always found myself capable of being my own pupil, and ready to love my teacher. End of author's preface. Recording by Ashranjan.
Chapter 1 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 1, Childhood. Chapter 1. The illegitimate son of Don Francisco Casanova was a native of Saragossa, the capital of Aragon, and in the year 1428 he carried off Donna Alla Palafax from her convent on the day after she had taken the veil. He was secretary to King Alfonso. He ran away with her to Rome, where, after 1 year of imprisonment, the Pope, Martin III, released Anna from her vows, and gave them the nuptial blessing at the insistence of Don Juan Casanova, Major Domo of the Vatican, and uncle of Don Jacob. All the children born from that marriage died in their infancy, with the exception of Don Juan, who in 1475 married Donna Eleanor Albini, of whom he had a son, Marco Antonio. In 1481, Don Juan, having killed an officer of the King of Naples, was compelled to leave Rome, and escape to Como with his wife and his son. But having left the city to seek his fortune, he died while travelling with Christopher Columbus in the year 1493. Marco Antonio became a noted poet of the school of Martial, and was secretary to Cardinal Pompeo Colonna. The satire against Giulio de Medici, which we found in his works, having made it necessary for him to leave Rome, he returned to Como, where he married Abondia Rezonica, the same Giulio de Medicis, having become pope under the name of Clement VII, pardoned him, and called him back to Rome with his wife. The city having been taken and ransacked by the imperialists in 1526, Marco Antonio died there from an attack of the plague. Otherwise he would have died of misery, the soldiers of Charles V having taken all he possessed. Pierre Valerian speaks of him in his work De Infelicitate Literatorium. 3 months after his death, his wife gave birth to Jacques Casanova, who died in France at a great age. Colonel in the army, commanded by Farnese, against Henry, King of Navarre, afterwards King of France. He had left in the city of Parma a son who married Teresa Conti, from whom he had Jacques, who in the year 1681 married Anna Roli. Jacques had two sons, Jean-Baptiste and Gaetin Joseph Jacques. The eldest left Parma in 1712 and was never heard of. The other also went away in 1715, being only 19 years old. This all I have found in my father's diary. From my mother's lips I have heard the following particulars. Gaetin Joseph Jacques left his family, madly in love with an actress named Fragoletta, who performed the chambermaids. In his poverty he determined to earn a living by making the most of his own person. At first he gave himself up to dancing, and 5 years afterwards became an actor, making himself conspicuous by his conduct still more than by his talent. Whether from fickleness or from jealousy, he abandoned the Fragoletta and joined in Venice a troupe of comedians then giving performances at the St. Samuel Theatre. Opposite the house in which he had taken his lodging resided a shoemaker, by name Jerome Frafuzzi, with his wife Marzia, and Zanetta, their only daughter, a perfect beauty, 16 years of age. The young actor fell in love with this girl, succeeded in gaining her affection, and in containing her consent to a runaway match. It was the only way to win her, for, being an actor, he never could have had Marzia's consent, still less Jerome's, as in their eyes a player was a most awful individual. The young lovers, provided with the necessary certificates and accompanied by 2 witnesses, presented themselves before the Patriarch of Venice, who performed over them the marriage ceremony. Marzia, Zanetta's mother, indulged in a good deal of exclamation, and her father died broken-hearted. I was born 9 months afterwards, on the 2nd of April, 1725. The following April my mother left me under the care of her own mother, who had forgiven her as soon as she had heard that my father had promised never to compel her to appear on the stage. This is a promise which all actors make to the young girls they marry, and which they never fulfil, simply because their wives never care much about claiming from them the performance of it. Moreover, it turned out a very fortunate thing for my mother that she had studied for the stage, for 9 years later, having been left a widow with 6 children, she could not have brought them up if it had not been for the resources she found in that profession. I was only 1 year old when my father left me to go to London, where he had an engagement. It was in that great city that my mother made her first appearance on the stage, and in that city likewise that she gave birth to my brother Francois, a celebrated painter of battles, now residing in Vienna, where he has followed his profession since 1783. Towards the end of the year 1728, my mother returned to Venice with her husband, and as she had become an actress, she continued her artistic life. In 1730 she was delivered of my brother Jean, who became director of the Academy of Painting in Dresden, and died there in 1795. And during the 3 following years she became the mother of 2 daughters, one of whom died at an early age, while the other married in Dresden, where she still lived in 1798. I had also a posthumous brother, who became a priest. He died in Rome 15 years ago. Let us now come to the dawn of my existence, in the character of a thinking being. The organ of memory began to develop itself in me at the beginning of August 1733. I had at that time reached the age of 8 years and 4 months. Of what may have happened to me before that period, I have not the faintest recollection. This is the circumstance. I was standing in the corner of a room, bending towards the wall, supporting my head, and my eyes fixed upon a stream of blood flowing from my nose to the ground. My grandmother Marzia, whose pet I was, came to me, bathed my face with cold water, and, unknown to everyone in the house, took me with her in a gondola as far as Muran, a thickly populated island only half a league distant from Venice. Alighting from the gondola, we entered a wretched hole, where we found an old woman sitting on a rickety bed, holding a black cat in her arms, with 5 or 6 more purring around her. The 2 old cronies held together a long discourse of which, most likely, I was the subject. At the end of the dialogue, which was carried on in the patios of Forli, the witch, having received a silver ducat from my grandmother, opened a box, took me in her arms, placed me in the box, and locked me in it, telling me not to be frightened. A piece of advice which would certainly have had the contrary effect, if I had had any wits about me, but I was stupefied. I kept myself quiet in a corner of the box, holding a handkerchief to my nose because it was still bleeding, and otherwise very indifferent to the uproar going on outside. I could hear in turn laughter, weeping, singing, screams, shrieks, and knocking against the box, but for all that I cared for naught. At last I am taken out of the box, the blood stops flowing. The wonderful old witch, after lavishing caresses upon me, takes off my clothes, lays me on the bed, burns some drugs, gathers the smoke in a sheet which she wraps around me, pronounces incantations, takes the sheets off me, and gives me 5 sugar plums of a very agreeable taste. Then she immediately rubs my temples and the nape of my neck, with an ointment exhaling a delightful perfume, and puts my clothes on me again. She told me that my hemorrhage would little by little leave me, provided I should never disclose to anyone what she had done to cure me, and she threatened me, on the other hand, with the loss of all my blood, and with death, should I ever breathe a word concerning these mysteries. After having thus taught me my lesson, she informed me that a beautiful lady would pay me a visit during the following night, and that she would make me happy, on condition that I should have sufficient control over myself, never to mention to anyone having received such a visit. Upon this we left and returned home. I fell asleep almost as soon as I was in bed, without giving a thought to the beautiful visitor I was to receive. But, waking up a few hours afterwards, I saw, or fancied I saw, coming down the chimney, a dazzling woman with immense hoops, splendidly attired, and wearing on her head a crown set with precious stones, which seemed to me sparkling with fire. With slow steps, but with a majestic and sweet countenance, she came forward and sat on my bed. Then, taking several small boxes from a pocket, she emptied their contents over my head, softly whispering a few words, and, after giving utterance to a long speech, not a single word of which I understood, she kissed me, and disappeared the same way she had came. I soon went again to sleep. The next morning my grandmother came to dress me, and the moment she was near my bed she cautioned me to be silent, threatening me with death if I dared to say anything respecting my night's adventures. This command, laid upon me by the only woman who had complete authority over me, and whose orders I was accustomed to obey blindly, caused me to remember the vision and to store it, with the seal of secrecy, in the innermost corner of my dawning memory. I had not, however, the slightest inclination to mention the circumstances to anyone, in the first place, because I did not suppose it would interest anybody, and in the second, because I would not have known whom to make a confidant of. My disease had rendered me dull and retired. Everybody pitied me, and left me to myself. My life was considerably likely to be but a short one, and as to my parents, they never spoke to me. After the journey to Muran, and the nocturnal visit of the fairy, I continued to have bleeding at the nose, but less from day to day, and my memory slowly developed itself. I learned to read in less than a month. It would be ridiculous, of course, to attribute this cure to such follies, but at the same time I think it would be wrong to assert that they did not in any way contribute to it. As far as the apparition of the beautiful queen is concerned, I have always deemed it to be a dream, unless it should have been some masquerade got up for the occasion. but it is not always in the druggist shops that are found the best remedies for severe diseases. Our ignorance is every day proved by some wonderful phenomenon, and I believe this to be the reason why it is so difficult to meet with a learned man entirely untainted with superstition. We know, as a matter of course, that there never have been any sorcerers in this world, yet it is true that their power has always existed in the estimation of those to whom crafty knaves have passed themselves off as such. Somnio nocturnos lemues portentaque Thessalia vides. Many things became real which, at first, had no existence but in our imagination, and, as a natural consequence, many facts which have been attributed to faith may not always have been miraculous, although they are true miracles for those who lend to faith a boundless power. The next circumstance of any importance to myself, which I recollect, happened 3 months after my trip to Muran, and 6 weeks before my father's death. I give it to my readers only to convey some idea of the manner in which my nature was expanding. One day, about the middle of November, I was with my brother Francois, 2 years younger than I, in my father's room, watching him attentively as he was working at optics. A huge lump of crystal, round and cut into facets, attracted my attention. I took it up, and having brought it near my eye, I was delighted to see that it multiplied objects. The wish to possess myself of it at once got hold of me, and, seeing myself unobserved, I took my opportunity, and hid it in my pocket. A few minutes after this my father looked about for his crystal, and, unable to find it, he concluded that one of us must have taken it. My brother asserted that he had not touched it, and I, although guilty, said the same. But my father, satisfied that he could not be mistaken, threatened to search us, and to thrash the one who had told him a story. I pretended to look for the crystal in every corner of the room, and, watching my opportunity, I slyly slipped it into the pocket of my brother's jacket. At first I was sorry for what I had done, for I might as well have feigned to find the crystal somewhere about the room, but the evil deed was past recall. My father, seeing that we were looking in vain, lost patience, searched us, found the unlucky ball of crystal in the pocket of the innocent boy, and inflicted upon him the promised thrashing. 3 or 4 years later I was foolish enough to boast before my brother of the trick I had then played on him. He never forgave me, and has never failed to take his revenge whenever the opportunity offered. However, having at a later period gone to confession, and accused myself to the priest of the sin with every circumstance surrounding it, I gained some knowledge which afforded me great satisfaction. My confessor, who was a Jesuit, told me that by the deed I had verified the meaning of my first name, Jacques, which he said meant in Hebrew supplanter, and that God had changed for that reason the name of the ancient patriarch into that of Israel, which meant knowing. He had deceived his brother Esau. 6 weeks after the above adventure, my father was attacked with an abscess in the head, which carried him off in a week. Dr. Zambili first gave him appellative remedies, and, seeing his mistake, he tried to mend it by administrating castoreum, which sent his patient into convulsions and killed him. The abscess broke out through the ear 1 minute after his death, taking its leave after killing him, as if it had no longer any business with him. My father departed this life in the very prime of his manhood. He was only 36 years of age, but he was followed to his grave by the regrets of the public, and more particularly of all the patricians amongst them, whom he was held as above his profession, not less on account of his gentlemanly behaviour than on account of his extensive knowledge in mechanics. 2 days before his death, feeling that his end was at hand, my father expressed a wish to see us all around his bed, in the presence of his wife, and of the Messieurs Gramini, 3 Venetian noblemen, whose protection he wished to entreat in our favour. After giving us his blessing, he requested our mother, who was drowned in tears, to give her sacred promise that she would not educate any of us for the stage, on which he never would have appeared himself, had he not been led to it by an unfortunate attachment. My mother gave her promise, and the three noblemen said they would see to its being faithfully kept. Circumstances helped our mother to fulfil her word. At that time my mother had been pregnant for 6 months, and she was allowed to remain away from the stage until after Easter. Beautiful and young as she was, she declined all the offers of marriage which were made to her, and, placing her trust in Providence, she courageously devoted herself to the task of bringing up her young family. She considered it a duty to think of me before the others, not so much from a feeling of preference, as in consequence of my disease, which had such an effect upon me that it was difficult to know what to do with me. I was very weak, without any appetite, unable to apply myself to anything, and I had all the appearance of an idiot. Physicians disagreed as to the cause of the disease. He loses, they would say, 2 pounds of blood every week, yet there cannot be more than 16 or 18 pounds in his body. What then can cause so abundant a bleeding? One assented that in me all the chyle turned into blood. Another was of the opinion that the air I was breathing must, at each inhalation, increase the quantity of blood in my lungs, and contended that this was the reason for which I always kept my mouth open. I heard of it all 6 years afterward, from M. Baffo, a great friend of my late father. This M. Baffo consulted with the celebrated Dr. Markop of Padua, who sent him his opinion by writing. This consultation, which I still have in my possession, says that our blood is an elastic fluid, which is liable to diminish or to increase in thickness, but never in quantity, and that my hemorrhage could only proceed from the thickness of the mass of my blood, which relieved itself in a natural way in order to facilitate circulation. The doctor added that I would have died long before, had not nature, in its wish for life, asserted itself, and he concluded by stating that the cause of the thickness of my blood could only be ascribed to the air I was breathing, and that consequently I must have a change of air, or every hope of cure be abandoned. He thought likewise that the stupidity so apparent on my countenance was caused by nothing else but the thickness of my blood. M. Baffo, a man of sublime genius, a most lascivious, yet a great and original poet, was therefore instrumental in bringing about the decision which was then taken to send me to Padua, and to him I am indebted for my life. He died 20 years after, the last of an ancient patrician family, but his poems, although obscene, will give everlasting fame to his name. The state inquisitors of Venice have contributed to his celebrity by their mistaken strictness. Their persecutions caused his manuscript works to become precious. They ought to have been aware that despised things are forgotten. As soon as the verdict given by Professor Makop had been approved of, the Abbé Grimani undertook to find me a good boarding-house in Padua for me, through a chemist of his acquaintance who resided in that city. His name was Ottaviani, and he was an antiquarian of some repute. In a few days the boarding-house was found, and on the 2nd day of April 1734, on the very day I had accomplished my 9th year, I was taken to Padua, in a burchiello along the Brenta Canal. We embarked at 10 o'clock in the evening, immediately after supper. The burchiello may be considered a small floating house. There is a large saloon with a smaller cabin at each end, and rooms for servants fore and aft. It is a long square, with a roof, and cut on each side by glazed windows with shutters. The voyage takes 8 hours. M. Grimani, M. Baffo, and my mother accompanied me. I slept with her in the saloon, and the two friends passed the night in one of the cabins. My mother rose at daybreak, opened one of the windows facing the bed, and the rays of the rising sun falling on my eyes, caused me to open them. The bed was too low for me to see the land. I could see through the window only the tops of the trees along the river. The boat was sailing with such an even movement that I could not realize the fact of our moving, so that the trees which, one after the other, were rapidly disappearing from my sight, caused me an extreme surprise. "Ah, dear mother!" I exclaimed, "what is this? The trees are walking?" At that very moment the two noblemen came in, and reading astonishment in my countenance, they asked me what my thoughts were so busy about. "How is it," I answered, "that the trees are walking?" They all laughed, but my mother, heaving a great sigh, told me in a tone of deep pity, "The boat is moving, the trees are not. Now dress yourself." I understood at once the reason of the phenomenon. "Then it may be," said I, "that the sun does not move, and that we, on the contrary, are revolving from west to east." At these words my good mother fairly screamed. M. Grimani pitied my foolishness, and I remained dismayed, grieved, and ready to cry. M. Baffo brought me life again. He rushed to me, embraced me tenderly, and said, "Thou art right, my child. The sun does not move. Take courage, give heed to your reasoning powers, and let others laugh." My mother, greatly surprised, asked him whether he had taken leave of his senses to give me such lessons. But the philosopher, not even condescending to answer her, went on sketching a theory in harmony with my young and simple intelligence. This was the first real pleasure I enjoyed in my life. Had it not been for M. Baffo, this circumstance might have been enough to degrade my understanding. The weakness of credulity would have become part of my mind. The ignorance of the two others would certainly have blunted in me the edge of a faculty which, perhaps, has not carried me very far in my afterlife, but to which alone I feel that I am indebted for every particle of happiness I enjoy when I look into myself. We reached Padua at an early hour, and went to Ottaviani's house. His wife loaded me with caresses. I found there 5 or 6 children, amongst them a girl of 8 years named Marie, and another of 7, Rose, beautiful as a seraph. 10 years later, Marie became the wife of the broker Colonda, and Rose, a few years afterwards, married a nobleman, Pier Marcello, and had 1 son and 2 daughters, one of whom was wedded to M. Pier Montesenigo, and the other to a nobleman of the Carrero family. This last marriage was afterwards nullified. I shall have, in the course of events, to speak of all these persons, and that is my reason for mentioning their names here. Ottaviani took us at once to the house where I was to board. It was only a few yards from his own residence, at Sainte Marie d'Avance, in the parish of Saint Michel, in the house of an old Sclavonian woman, who let the first floor to Signora Mida, wife of a Sclavonian colonel. My small trunk was laid open before the old woman, to whom was handed an inventory of all its contents, together with 6 sequins for 6 months paid in advance. From this small sum she undertook to feed me, to keep me clean, and to send me to a day school. Protesting that it was not enough, she accepted these terms. I was kissed, and strongly commanded to be always obedient and docile, and I was left with her. In this way did my family get rid of me. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova, Episode 1, Childhood, Chapter 2. My grandmother comes to Padua and takes me to Dr. Gozzi's school. My first love affair. As soon as I was left alone with this Sclavonian woman, she took me up to the garret, where she pointed out my bed in a row with 4 others, 3 of which belonged to 3 young boys of my age, who at that moment were at school, and the 4th to a servant girl whose province it was to watch us and to prevent the many peccadilloes in which schoolboys are wont to indulge. After this visit we came downstairs, and I was taken to the garden with permission to walk about until dinner time. I felt neither happy nor unhappy. I had nothing to say. I had neither fear nor hope, nor even a feeling of curiosity. I was neither cheerful nor sad. The only thing which grated upon me was the face of the mistress of the house. Although I had not the faintest idea either of beauty or of ugliness, her face, her countenance, her tone of voice, her language, everything in that woman was repulsive to me. Her masculine features repelled me every time I lifted my eyes towards her face to listen to what she said to me. She was tall and coarse like a trooper. Her complexion was yellow, her hair black, her eyebrows long and thick, and her chin gloried in a respectable, bristly beard. To complete the picture, her hideous, half-naked bosom was hanging halfway down her long chest. She may have been about 50. The servant was a stout country girl who did all the work of the house. The garden was a square of some 30 feet, which had no other beauty than its green appearance. Towards noon my 3 companions came back from school, and they at once spoke to me as if we had been old acquaintances, naturally giving me credit for such intelligence as belonged to my age, but which I did not possess. I did not answer them, but they were not baffled, and they at last prevailed upon me to share their innocent pleasures. I had to run, to carry and be carried, to turn head over heels, and I allowed myself to be initiated into those arts with a pretty good grace until we were summoned to dinner. I sat down to the table, but seeing before me a wooden spoon, I pushed it back, asking for my silver spoon and fork, to which I was much attached, because they were a gift from my good old granny. The servant answered that the mistress wished to maintain equality between the boys, and I had to submit, much to my disgust. Having thus learned that equality in everything was the rule of the house, I went to work like the others and began to eat the soup out of the common dish, and if I did not complain of the rapidity with which my companions made it disappear, I could not help wondering at such inequality being allowed. To follow this very poor soup, we had a small portion of dried cod and 1 apple each, and dinner was over. It was in Lent. We had neither glasses nor cups, and we all helped ourselves out of the same earthen pitcher to a miserable drink called graspia, which is made by boiling in water the stems of grapes stripped of their fruit. From the following day I drank nothing but water. This way of living surprised me, for I did not know whether I had a right to complain of it. After dinner the servant took me to the school, kept by a young priest, Dr. Gozzi, with whom this Sclavonian woman had bargained for my schooling at the rate of 40 sous a month, or the 11th part of a sequin. The first thing to do was to teach me writing, and I was placed amongst children of 5 and 6 years, who did not fail to turn me into ridicule on account of my age. On my return to the boarding house, I had my supper, which, as a matter of course, was worse than the dinner, and I could not make out why the right of complaint should be denied me. I was then put to bed, but there 3 well-known species of vermin kept me awake all night, besides the rats, which, running all over the garret, jumped on my bed, and fairly made my blood run cold with fright. This is the way in which I began to feel misery, and to learn how to suffer it patiently. The vermin which feasted upon me lessened my fear of the rats, and by a very lucky system of compensation, the dread of the rats made me less sensitive to the bites of the vermin. My mind was reaping benefit from the very struggle fought between the evils which surrounded me. The servant was perfectly deaf to my screaming. As soon as it was daylight, I ran out of the wretched garret, and, after complaining to the girl of all I had endured during the night, I asked her to give me a clean shirt, the one I had on being disgusting to look at, but she answered that I could only change my linen on a Sunday, and laughed at me when I threatened to complain to the mistress. For the first time in my life I shed tears of sorrow and anger when I heard my companions scoffing at me. The poor wretches shared my unhappy condition, but they were used to it, and that makes all the difference. Sorely depressed, I went to school, but only to sleep soundly through the morning. One of my comrades, in the hope of turning the affair into ridicule at my expense, told the doctor the reason of my being so sleepy. The good priest, however, to whom without doubt Providence had guided me, called me into his private room, listened to all I had to say, saw with his own eyes the proofs of my misery, and moved by the sight of the blisters which disfigured my innocent skin, he took up his cloak, went with me to the boarding house, and showed the woman the state I was in. She put on a look of great astonishment, and threw all the blame upon the servant. The doctor, being curious to see my bed, I was, as much as he was, surprised at the filthy state of the sheets in which I had passed the night. The accursed woman went on blaming the servant, and said that she would discharge her, but the girl, happening to be close by, and not relishing the accusation, told her boldly that the fault was her own, and she then threw open the beds of my companions to show us that they did not experience any better treatment. The mistress, raving, slapped her on the face, and the servant, to be even with her, returned the compliment and ran away. The doctor left me there, saying that I could not enter his school unless I was sent to him as clean as the other boys. The result for me was a very sharp rebuke, with the threat, as a finishing stroke, that if I ever caused such a broil again, I would be ignominiously turned out of the house. I could not make it out. I had just entered life, and I had no knowledge of any other place but the house in which I had been born, in which I had been brought up, and in which I had always seen cleanliness and honest comfort. Here I found myself ill-treated, scolded, although it did not seem possible that any blame could be attached to me. At last the old shrew tossed the shirt in my face, and an hour later I saw a new servant changing the sheets, after which we had our dinner. My schoolmaster took particular care in instructing me. He gave me a seat at his own desk, and in order to show my proper appreciation of such a favor, I gave myself up to studies. At the end of the first month I could write so well that I was promoted to the grammar class. The new life I was leading, the half-starvation system to which I was condemned, and most likely more than everything else, the air of Padua, brought me health such as I had never enjoyed before, but that very state of blooming health made it still more difficult for me to bear the hunger which I was compelled to endure. It became unbearable. I was growing rapidly. I enjoyed 9 hours of deep sleep, unbroken by any dreams, save that I always fancied myself sitting at a well-spread table and gratifying my cruel appetite, but every morning I could realize in full the vanity and the unpleasant disappointment of flattering dreams. This ravenous appetite would at last have weakened me to death, had I not made up my mind to pounce upon and to swallow every kind of eatables I could find, whenever I was certain of not being seen. Necessity begets ingenuity. I had spied in a cupboard of the kitchen some 50 red herrings. I devoured them all one after the other, as well as all the sausages which were hanging in the chimney to be smoked, and in order to accomplish those feats without being detected, I was in the habit of getting up at night and of undertaking my foraging expeditions under the friendly veil of darkness. Every new laid egg I could discover in the poultry yard, quite warm and scarcely dropped by the hen, was a most delicious treat. I would even go as far as the kitchen of the schoolmaster in the hope of pilfering something to eat. The Sclavonian woman, in despair at being unable to catch the thieves, turned away servant after servant. But in spite of all my expeditions, as I could not always find something to steal, I was as thin as a walking skeleton. My progress at school was so rapid during 4 or 5 months that the master promoted me to the rank of dux. My province was to examine the lessons of my 30 school fellows, to correct their mistakes, and report to the master with whatever note of blame or of approval I thought they deserved. But my strictness did not last long, for idle boys soon found out the way to enlist my sympathy. When their Latin lesson was full of mistakes, they would buy me off with cutlets and roast chickens. They even gave me money. These proceedings excited my covetousness, or rather my gluttony, and, not satisfied with levying a tax upon the ignorant, I became a tyrant, and I refused well-merited approbation to all those who declined paying the contribution I demanded. At last, unable to bear my injustice any longer, the boys accused me, and the master, seeing me convicted of extortion, removed me from my exalted position. I would very likely have fared badly after my dismissal, had not fate decided to put an end to my cruel apprenticeship. Dr. Godsey, who was so attached to me, called me privately one day into his study, and asked me whether I would feel disposed to carry out the advice he would give me in order to bring about my removal from the house of the Sclavonian woman, and my admission in his own family. Finding me delighted at such an offer, he caused me to copy 3 letters which I sent, one to the Abbé Grimani, another to my friend Baffo, and the last to my excellent grandam. The half-year was nearly out, and my mother not being in Venice at that period, there was no time to lose. In my letters I gave a description of all my sufferings, and I prognosticated my death were I not immediately removed from my boarding house and placed under the care of my schoolmaster, who was disposed to receive me, but he wanted 2 sequins a month. M. Grimani did not answer me, and commissioned his friend Ottaviani to scold me for allowing myself to be ensnared by the doctor. But M. Baffo went to consult with my grandmother, who could not write, and in a letter which he addressed to me, he informed me that I would soon find myself in a happier situation. And truly, within a week, the excellent old woman who loved me until her death made her appearance as I was sitting down to my dinner. She came in with the mistress of the house, and the moment I saw her, I threw my arms around her neck, crying bitterly, in which luxury the old lady soon joined me. She sat down and took me on her knees. My courage rose again. In the presence of the Sclavonian woman, I enumerated all my grievances, and after calling her attention to the food, fit only for beggars, which I was compelled to swallow, I took her upstairs to show her my bed. I begged her to take me out and give me a good dinner after 6 months of such starvation. The boarding-house keeper boldly asserted that she could not afford better for the amount she had received, and there was truth in that, but she had no business to keep house and to become the tormentor of poor children who were thrown on her hands by stinginess, and who required to be properly fed. My grandmother very quietly intimated her intention to take me away forthwith, and asked her to pull all my things in my trunk. I cannot express my joy during these preparations. For the first time I felt that kind of happiness which makes forgiveness compulsory upon the being who enjoys it, and causes him to forget all previous unpleasantness. My grandmother took me to the inn, and dinner was served, but she could hardly eat anything in her astonishment at the voracity with which I was swallowing my food. In the meantime, Dr. Gozzi, to whom she had sent notice of her arrival, came in, and his appearance soon prepossessed her in his favour. He was then a fine-looking priest, 26 years of age, chubby, modest, and respectful. In less than a quarter of an hour everything was satisfactorily arranged between them. The good old lady counted out 24 sequins for 1 year of my schooling, and took a receipt for the same, but she kept me with her for 3 days, in order to have me clothed like a priest, and to get me a wig, as the filthy state of my hair made it necessary to have it all cut off. At the end of the 3 days she took me to the doctor's house, so as to see herself to my installation, and to recommend me to the doctor's mother, who desired her to send or to buy in Padua a bedstead and bedding. But the doctor having remarked that, his own bed being very wide, I might sleep with him, my grandmother expressed her gratitude for all his kindness, and we accompanied her as far as the Burchiello she had engaged to return to Venice. The family of Dr. Gozzi was composed of his mother, who had great reverence for him, because, a peasant by birth, she did not think herself worthy of having a son who was a priest, and still more a doctor in divinity. She was plain, old, and cross. And of his father, a shoemaker by trade, working all day long, and never addressing a word to anyone, not even during the meals. He only became a sociable being on holidays, on which occasions he would spend his time with his friends in some tavern, coming home at midnight as drunk as a lord, and singing verses from Tasso. When in this blissful state the good man could not make up his mind to go to bed, and became violent if anyone attempted to compel him to lie down. Wine alone gave him sense and spirit, for when sober he was incapable of attending to the simplest family matter, and his wife often said that he never would have married her had not his friends taken care to give him a good breakfast before he went to the church. But Dr. Gozzi had also a sister called Bettina, who at the age of 13 was pretty, lively, and a great reader of romances. Her father and mother scolded her constantly because she was too often looking out of the window, and the doctor did the same on account of her love for reading. This girl took at once my fancy without my knowing why, and little by little she kindled in my heart the first spark of a passion which afterwards became in me the ruling one. 6 months after I had been an inmate in the house, the doctor found himself without scholars. They all went away because I had become the sole object of his affection. He then determined to establish a college, and to receive young boys as boarders, but 2 years passed before he met with any success. During that period he taught me everything he knew. True, it was not much, yet it was enough to open to me the high road to all sciences. He likewise taught me the violin, an accomplishment which proved very useful to me in a peculiar circumstance, the particulars of which I will give in good time. The excellent doctor, who was in no way a philosopher, made me study the logic of the Peripatetics, and the cosmography of the ancient system of Ptolemy, at which I would laugh, teasing the poor doctor with theorems to which he could find no answer. His habits, moreover, were irreproachable, and in all things connected with religion, although not a bigot, he was of the greatest strictness, and admitting everything as an article of faith, nothing appeared difficult to his conception. He believed the deluge to have been universal, and he thought that, before that great cataclysm, men lived 1,000 years and conversed with God. that Noah took 100 years to build the ark, and that the earth, suspended in the air, is firmly held in the very center of the universe, which God had created from nothing. When I would say and prove that it was absurd to believe in the existence of nothingness, he would stop me short and call me a fool. He could enjoy a good bed, a glass of wine, and cheerfulness at home. He did not admire fine wits, good jests, or criticisms, because it easily turns to slander, and he would laugh at the folly of men reading newspapers which, in his opinion, always lied and constantly repeated the same things. He asserted that nothing was more troublesome than incertitude, and therefore he condemned thought because it gives birth to doubt. His ruling passion was preaching, for which his face and his voice qualified him. His congregation was almost entirely composed of women, of whom, however, he was the sworn enemy. So much so that he would not look them in the face even when he spoke to them. Weakness of the flesh and fornication appeared to him the most monstrous of sins, and he would be very angry if I dared to assert that, in my estimation, they were the most venial of faults. His sermons were crammed with passages from the Greek authors, which he translated into Latin. One day I ventured to remark that those passages ought to be translated into Italian, because women did not understand Latin any more than Greek. But he took offense, and I never had afterwards the courage to allude any more to the matter. Moreover, he praised me to his friends as a wonder, because I had learned to read Greek alone, without any assistance but a grammar. During Lent in the year 1736, my mother wrote to the doctor, and as she was on the point of her departure for St. Petersburg, she wished to see me and requested him to accompany me to Venice for 3 or 4 days. This invitation sent him thinking, for he had never seen Venice, never frequented good company, and yet he did not wish to appear a novice in anything. We were soon ready to leave Padua, and all the family escorted us to the Burchiello. My mother received the doctor with a most friendly welcome, but she was strikingly beautiful, and my poor master felt very uncomfortable, not daring to look her in the face, and yet called upon to converse with her. She saw the dilemma he was in, and thought she would have some amusing sport about it, should opportunity present itself. I, in the meantime, drew the attention of everyone in her circle. Everybody had known me as a fool, and was amazed at my improvement in the short space of 2 years. The doctor was overjoyed, because he saw that the full credit of my transformation was given to him. The first thing which struck my mother unpleasantly was my light-colored wig, which was not in harmony with my dark complexion, and contrasted most woefully with my black eyes and eyebrows. She inquired from the doctor why I did not wear my own hair, and he answered that with a wig it was easier for his sister to keep me clean. Everyone smiled at the simplicity of the answer, but the merriment increased when, to the question made by my mother whether his sister was married, I took the answer upon myself, and said that Bettina was the prettiest girl of Padua, and was only 14 years of age. My mother promised the doctor a splendid present for his sister on condition that she would let me wear my own hair, and he promised her that her wishes would be complied with. The peruke maker was then called, and I had a wig which matched my complexion. Soon afterwards all the guests began to play cards, with the exception of my master, and I went to see my brothers in my grandmother's room. Francois showed me some architectural designs which I pretended to admire. Jean had nothing to show me, and I thought him a rather insignificant boy. The others were still very young. At the supper table the doctor, seated next to my mother, was very awkward. He would very likely not have said one word had not an Englishman, a writer of talent, addressed him in Latin. But the doctor, being unable to make him out, modestly answered that he did not understand English, which caused much hilarity. M. Buffo, however, explained the puzzle by telling us that Englishmen read and pronounced Latin in the same way that they read and spoke their own language, and I remarked that Englishmen were wrong as much as we would be if we pretended to read and pronounce their language according to Latin rules. The Englishman, pleased with my reasoning, wrote down the following old couplet and gave it to me to read. Dicite, grammatici, cur mascula nomina cunnus, e cur femineum mentula nomen habet. After reading it aloud, I exclaimed, "This is Latin indeed!" "We know that," said my mother, "but can you explain it?" "To explain it is not enough," I answered. "It is a question which is worthy of an answer." And after considering for a moment, I wrote the following pentameter. Disce quod ad domino nomina servus habet. This was my first literary exploit, and I may say that in that very instant the seed of my love for literary fame was sown in my breast, for the applause lavished upon me exalted me to the very pinnacle of happiness. The Englishman, quite amazed at my answer, said that no boy of 11 years had ever accomplished such a feat, embraced me repeatedly, and presented me with his watch. My mother, inquisitive like a woman, asked M. Grimani to tell her the meaning of the lines, but as the abbé was not any wiser than she was, M. Baffo translated it in a whisper. Surprised at my knowledge, she rose from her chair to get a valuable gold watch and present it to my master, who, not knowing how to express his deep gratitude, treated us to the most comic scene. My mother, in order to save him from the difficulty of paying her a compliment, offered him her cheek. He had only to give her a couple of kisses, the easiest and the most innocent thing in good company. But the poor man was on burning coals, and so completely out of countenance that he would, I truly believe, rather have died than give the kisses. He drew back with his head down, and he was allowed to remain in peace until we retired for the night. When we found ourselves alone in our room, he poured out his heart and exclaimed that it was a pity he could not publish in Padua the distich of my answer. "And why not?" I said. "Because both are obscene." "But they are sublime." "Let us go to bed and speak no more on the subject. Your answer was wonderful, because you cannot possibly know anything of the subject in question, or the manner in which verses ought to be written." As far as the subject was concerned, I knew it by theory, for, unknown to the doctor, and because he had forbidden it, I had read Meursius, but it was natural that he should be amazed at my being able to write verses when he, who had taught me prosody, never could compose a single line. Nemo dat quod non habet is a false axiom when applied to mental acquirements. 4 days afterwards, as we were preparing for our departure, my mother gave me a parcel for Bettina, and M. Grimani presented me with 4 sequins to buy books. A week later my mother left for St. Petersburg. After our return to Padua, my good master for 3 or 4 months never ceased to speak of my mother, and Bettina, having found in the parcel 5 yards of black silk and 12 pairs of gloves, became singularly attached to me, and took such good care of my hair that in less than 6 months I was able to give up wearing the wig. She used to comb my hair every morning, often before I was out of bed, saying that she had not time to wait until I was dressed. She washed my face, my neck, my chest, lavished on me childish caresses, which I thought innocent, but which caused me to be angry with myself, because I felt that they excited me. 3 years younger than she was, it seemed to me that she could not love me with any idea of mischief, and the consciousness of my own vicious excitement put me out of temper with myself. When, seated on my bed, she would say that I was getting stouter, and would have the proof of it with her own hands, she caused me the most intense emotion. But I said nothing, for fear she would remark my sensitiveness, and when she would go on saying that my skin was soft, the tickling sensation made me draw back, angry with myself that I did not dare to do the same to her, but delighted at her not guessing how I longed to do it. When I was dressed, she often gave me the sweetest kisses, calling me her darling child, but whatever wish I had to follow her example, I was not yet bold enough. After some time, however, Bettina laughing at my timidity, I became more daring, and returned her kisses with interest, but I always gave way the moment I felt a wish to go further. I then would turn my head, pretending to look for something, and she would go away. She was scarcely out of the room before I was in despair at not having followed the inclination of my nature, and astonished at the fact that Bettina could do to me all she was in the habit of doing, without feeling any excitement from it, while I could hardly refrain from pushing my attacks further. I would every day determine to change my way of acting. In the early part of autumn, the doctor received 3 new boarders, and one of them, who was 15 years old, appeared to me in less than a month on very friendly terms with Bettina. This circumstance caused me a feeling of which until then I had no idea, and which I only analyzed a few years afterwards. It was neither jealousy nor indignation, but a noble contempt which I thought ought not to be repressed, because Cordiani, an ignorant, coarse boy, without talent or polite education, the son of a simple farmer, and incapable of competing with me in anything, having over me but the advantage of dawning manhood, did not appear to me a fit person to be preferred to me. My young self-esteem whispered that I was above him. I began to nurse a feeling of pride mixed with contempt, which told against Bettina, whom I loved, unknown to myself. She soon guessed it from the way I would receive her caresses when she came to comb my hair while I was in bed. I would repulse her hands, and no longer return her kisses. One day, vexed at my answering her questions as to the reason of my change towards her by stating that I had no cause for it, she told me in a tone of commiseration that I was jealous of Cordiani. This reproach sounded to me like a debasing slander. I answered that Cordiani was, in my estimation, as worthy of her as she was worthy of him. She went away smiling, but revolving in her mind the only way by which she could be revenged, she thought herself bound to render me jealous. However, as she could not attain such an end without making me fall in love with her, this is the policy she adopted. One morning she came to me as I was in bed, and brought me a pair of white stockings of her own knitting. After dressing my hair, she asked my permission to try the stockings on herself, in order to correct any deficiency in the other pairs she intended to knit for me. The doctor had gone out to say his mass. As she was putting on the stockings, she remarked that my legs were not clean, and without any more ado, she immediately began to wash them. I would have been ashamed to let her see my bashfulness. I let her do as she liked, not foreseeing what would happen. Bettina, seated on my bed, carried too far her love for cleanliness, and her curiosity caused me such intense voluptuousness that the feeling did not stop until it could be carried no further. Having recovered my calm, I bethought myself that I was guilty, and begged her forgiveness. She did not expect this, and after considering for a few moments, she told me kindly that the fault was entirely her own, but that she never would again be guilty of it, and she went out of the room, leaving me to my own thoughts. They were of a cruel character. It seemed to me that I had brought dishonor upon Bettina, that I had betrayed the confidence of her family, offended against the sacred laws of hospitality, that I was guilty of a most wicked crime, which I could only atone for by marrying her, in case Bettina could make up her mind to accept for her husband a wretch unworthy of her. These thoughts rarely ceased her morning visits by my bedside. During the first week I could easily account for the girl's reserve, and my sadness would soon have taken the character of the warmest love, had not her manners towards Cordiani inoculated in my veins the poison of jealousy. Although I never dreamed of accusing her of the same crime towards him that she had committed upon me. I felt convinced, after due consideration, that the act she had been guilty of with me had been deliberately done, and that her feelings of repentance kept her away from me. This conviction was rather flattering to my vanity, as it gave me the hope of being loved, and the end of all my commonings was that I made up my mind to write to her, and thus to give her courage. I composed a letter short, but calculated to restore peace to her mind, whether she thought herself guilty, or suspected me of feelings contrary to those which her dignity might expect from me. My letter was, in my own estimation, a perfect masterpiece, and just the kind of epistle by which I was certain to conquer her very adoration, and to sing for ever the son of Cordiani, whom I could not accept as the sort of being likely to make her hesitate for one instant in her choice between him and me. Half an hour after the receipt of my letter, she told me herself that the next morning she would pay me her usual visit, but I waited in vain. This conduct provoked me almost to madness, but my surprise was indeed great when, at the breakfast table, she asked me whether I would let her dress me up as a girl to accompany her 5 or 6 days later to a ball for which a neighbor of ours, Dr. Olivo, had sent letters of invitation. Everybody having seconded the motion, I gave my consent. I thought this arrangement would afford a favourable opportunity for an explanation, for mutual vindication, and would open a door for the most complete reconciliation, without fear of any surprise arising from the proverbial weakness of the flesh. But a most unexpected circumstance prevented our attending the ball, and brought forth a comedy with a truly tragic turn. Dr. Gozzi's godfather, a man advanced in age and in easy circumstances, residing in the country, thought himself, after severe illness, very near his end, and sent to the doctor a carriage with a request to come to him at once with his father, as he wished them to be present at his death, and to pray for his departing soul. The old shoemaker drained a bottle, donned his Sunday clothes, and went off with his son. I thought this a favourable opportunity, and determined to improve it, considering that the night of the ball was too remote to suit my impatience. I therefore managed to tell Bettina that I would leave ajar the door of my room, and that I would wait for her as soon as everyone in the house had gone to bed. She promised to come. She slept on the ground floor in a small closet, divided only by a partition from her father's chamber. The doctor being away, I was alone in the large room. The 3 boarders had their apartment in a different part of the house, and I had therefore no mishap to fear. I was delighted at the idea that I had at last reached the moment so ardently desired. The instant I was in my room, I bolted my door and opened the one leading to the passage, so that Bettina should have only to push it in order to come in. I then put my light out, but did not undress. When we read of such situations in a romance, we think they are exaggerated. They are not so, and the passage in which Ariosto represents Roger waiting for Alcine is a beautiful picture painted from nature. Until midnight I waited without feeling much anxiety, but I heard the clock strike 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning without seeing Bettina. My blood began to boil, and I was soon in a state of furious rage. It was snowing hard, but I shook from passion more than from cold. 1 hour before daybreak, unable to master any longer my impatience, I made up my mind to go downstairs with bare feet so as not to wake the dog, and to place myself at the bottom of the stairs within a yard of Bettina's door, which ought to have been opened if she had gone out of her room. I reached the door. It was closed, and as it could be locked only from the inside, I imagined that Bettina had fallen asleep. I was on the point of knocking at the door, but was prevented by fear of rows or 4 yards. Overwhelmed with grief and unable to take a decision, I sat down on the last step of the stairs. But at daybreak, chilled, benumbed, shivering with cold, afraid that the servant would see me and would think I was mad, I determined to go back to my room. I am that I am going to see her, and hope lending me new strength, I draw nearer to the door. It opens, but instead of Bettina coming out, I see Cordiani, who gives me such a furious kick in the stomach that I am thrown at a distance, deep in the snow. Without stopping a single instant, Cordiani is off, and locks himself up in the room which he shared with the brothers Feltrini. I picked myself up quickly with the intention of taking my revenge upon Bettina, whom nothing could have saved from the effects of my rage at that moment. But I find her door locked. I kick vigorously against it, the dog starts a loud barking, and I make a hurried retreat to my room, in which I lock myself up, throwing myself in bed to compose and heal up my mind and body, for I was half dead. Deceived, humbled, ill-treated, an object of contempt to the happy and triumphant Cordiani, I spent 3 hours ruminating the darkest schemes of revenge. To poison them both seemed to me but a trifle in that terrible moment of bitter misery. This project gave way to another as extravagant, as cowardly, namely, to go at once to her brother and disclose everything to him. I was 12 years of age, and my mind had not yet acquired sufficient coolness to mature schemes of heroic revenge, which are produced by false feelings of honor. This was only my apprenticeship in such adventures. I was in that state of mind when suddenly I heard outside of my door the gruff voice of Bettina's mother, who begged me to come down, adding that her daughter was dying. As I would have been very sorry if she had departed this life before she could feel the effects of my revenge, I got up hurriedly and went downstairs, and surrounded by the whole family. Half dressed, nearly bent in two, she was throwing her body now to the right, now to the left, striking at random with her feet and with her fists, and extricating herself by violent shaking from the hands of those who endeavored to keep her down. With this sight before me, and the night's adventure still in my mind, I hardly knew what to think. I had no knowledge of human nature, no knowledge of artifice and tricks, and I could not understand how I found myself coolly witnessing such a scene, and composedly calm in the presence of 2 beings, one of whom I intended to kill and the other to dishonor. At the end of an hour, Bettina fell asleep. A nurse and Dr. Olivo came soon after. The first said that the convulsions were caused by hysterics, but the doctor said no, and prescribed rest and cold baths. I said nothing, but I could not refrain from laughing at them, for I knew, or rather guessed, that Bettina's sickness was the result of her nocturnal employment, or of the fright which she must have felt at my meeting with Cordiani. At all events, I determined to postpone my revenge until the return of her brother, although I had not the slightest suspicion that her illness was all sham, I had to pass through Bettina's closet, and seeing her dress handy on the bed, I took it into my head to search her pockets. I found a small note, and recognizing Cordiani's handwriting, I took possession of it to read it in my room. I marveled at the girl's imprudence, for her mother might have discovered it, and being unable to read, would very likely have given it to the doctor, her son. I thought she must have taken leave of her senses, but my feelings may be appreciated when I read the following words. As your father is away, it is not necessary to leave your door ajar as usual. When we leave the supper table, I will go to your closet. You will find me there. When I recovered from my stupor, I gave way to an irresistible fit of laughter, and seeing how completely I had been duped, I thought I was cured of my love. Cordiani appeared to me deserving of forgiveness, and Bettina of contempt. I congratulated myself upon having received a lesson of such importance for the remainder of my life. I even went so far as to acknowledge to myself that Bettina had been quite right in giving the preference to Cordiani, who was 15 years old, while I was only a child. Yet in spite of my good disposition to forgiveness, the kick administered by Cordiani was still heavy upon my memory, and I could not help keeping a grudge against him. At noon, as we were at dinner in the kitchen, where we took our meals on account of the cold weather, Bettina began again to raise piercing screams. Everybody rushed to her room, but I quietly kept my seat and finished my dinner, after which I went to my studies. In the evening, when I came down to supper, I found that Bettina's bed had been brought to the kitchen close by her mother's. But it was no concern of mine, and I remained likewise perfectly indifferent to the noise made during the night and to the confusion which took place in the morning, when she had a fresh fit of convulsions. Dr. Gozzi and his father returned in the evening. Cordiani, who felt uneasy, came to inquire from me what my intentions were, but I rushed towards him with an open penknife in my hand, and he beat a hasty retreat. I had entirely abandoned the idea of relating the night's scandalous adventure to the doctor, for such a project I could only entertain in a moment of excitement and rage. The next day the preamble that she had discovered the character of her daughter's illness, that it was caused by a spell thrown over her by a witch, and that she knew careful not to make a mistake. Who is the witch of it? How so? I have barred the door of my room with 2 broomsticks placed in the shape of a cross, which she must have undone to go in. But when she saw them she drew back, and she went round by the other door. It is evident that, were she not a witch, she would not be afraid of touching them. It is not complete evidence, dear mother. Send the woman to me. The servant made her appearance. Why, said the doctor, did you not enter my mother's room this morning through the usual door? I do not know what you mean. Did you not see the St. Andrew's cross on the door? What cross is that? Where did you sleep last Thursday night? At my niece's, who had just been confined. Nothing of the sort. You were at the witch's Sabbath. You are a witch, and have bewitched my daughter. The poor woman, indignant at such an accusation, spits at her mistress's face. The mistress, enraged, gets hold of a stick to give the servant a drubbing. The doctor endeavours to keep his mother back, but he is compelled to let her loose and to run after the servant, who was hurrying down the stairs, screaming and howling, in order to rouse the neighbours. He catches her and finally succeeds in pacifying her with some money. After this comical but rather scandalous exhibition, the doctor donned his vestments for the purpose of exorcising his sister and of ascertaining whether she was truly possessed of an unclean spirit. The novelty of this mystery attracted the whole of my attention. All the inmates of the house appeared to me either mad or stupid, for I could not, for the life of me, imagine that diabolical spirits were dwelling in Bettina's body. When we drew near her bed, her breathing had, to all appearance, stopped, and the exorcisms of her brother did not restore it. Dr. Olivo happened to come in at that moment, and inquired whether faith, upon which he left, saying that he had no faith in any miracles except in those of the gospel. Soon after, Dr. Gozzi went to his room, and finding myself alone with Bettina, I bent down over her bed and whispered in her ear, "Take courage, get well again, and rely upon my discretion." She turned her head towards the wall and did not answer me, but the day passed off without any more convulsions. I thought I had cured her, but on the following day the frenzy went up to the brain, and in her delirium she pronounced at random Greek and Latin words without any meaning, and then no doubt whatever was entertained of her being possessed of the evil spirit. Her mother went out, and returned soon, accompanied by the most renowned exorcist of Padua, a very ill-featured Capuchin called Friar Prospero da Bovolenta. The moment Bettina saw the exorcist, she burst into loud laughter, and addressed to him the most offensive insults, which fairly delighted everybody, as the devil alone could be bold enough to address a Capuchin in such a manner. But the holy man, hearing himself called an obtrusive ignoramus and a stinkard, went on striking Bettina with a heavy crucifix, saying that he was beating the devil. He stopped only when he saw her on the point of hurling at him the chamber utensil which she had just seized. "If it is the devil who has offended thee with his words," she said, "resent the insult with words likewise, jackass that thou art. But if I have offended thee myself, learn, stupid booby, that thou must respect me, and be off at once." I could see poor Dr. Gozzi blushing. The friar, however, held his ground, and armed at all points began to read a terrible exorcism, at the end of which he commanded the devil to state his name. "My name is Bettina." "It cannot be, for it is the name of a baptized girl." "Then thou art of opinion that a devil must rejoice in a masculine name? Learn, ignorant friar, that a devil is a spirit, and does not belong to either sex. But to answer me with truth, and I will engage to give way before thy incantations." "Very well, I agree to this. Tell me then, art thou thinking that thy knowledge is greater than mine?" "No, but I believe myself more powerful in the name of the Holy Trinity, and by my sacred character." "If thou art more powerful than I, then prevent me from telling thee unpalatable truths. Thou art very vain of thy beard, thou art combing and dressing it 10 times a day, and thou wouldst not shave half of it to get me out of this body. Cut off thy beard, and I promise to come out." "Father of lies, I will increase thy punishment 100-fold. I dare thee to do it." After saying these words, Bettina broke in such a loud peal of laughter that I could not refrain from joining in it. The Capuchin, turning towards Dr. Gozzi, told him that I was wanting in faith, and that I ought to leave the room, which I did, remarking that he had guessed rightly. I was not yet out of the room when the friar offered his hand to Bettina for her to kiss, and I had the pleasure of seeing her spit upon it. This strange girl, full of extraordinary talent, made rare sport of the friar, without causing any surprise to perceive what her purpose was in playing such a part. The Capuchin dined with us, and during the meal he uttered a good deal of nonsense. After dinner he returned to Bettina's chamber with the intention of blessing her, but as soon as she caught sight of him, she took up a glass full of some black mixture sent from the apothecary and threw it at his head. Cordiani, being close by the friar, came in for a good share of the liquid, an accident which afforded me the greatest delight. Bettina was quite right to improve her opportunity, as everything she did was, of course, put to the account of the unfortunate devil. Not overmuch pleased, Friar Prospero, as he left the house, told the doctor that there was no doubt of the girl being possessed, but that another exorcist must be sent for, since he had not himself obtained God's grace to eject the evil spirit. After he had gone, Bettina kept very calm for 6 hours, and in the evening, to our great surprise, she joined us at the supper table. She told her parents that she felt quite well, spoke to her brother, and then, addressing me, she remarked that, the ball taking place on the morrow, she would come to my room in the morning to dress my hair like a girl's. I thanked her and said that, as she had been so ill, she ought to nurse herself. She soon retired to bed, and we remained at the table talking to her. When I was undressing for the night, I took up my nightcap and found in it a small note with these words: "You must accompany me to the ball, disguised as a girl, or I will give you a sight which will cause you to weep." I waited until the doctor was asleep, and I wrote the following answer: "I cannot go to the ball because I have fully made up my mind to avoid every opportunity of being alone with you. As for the painful sight with which you threaten to entertain me, I believe you capable of keeping your word, but I entreat you to spare my heart, for I love you as if you were my sister. I have forgiven you, dear Bettina, and I wish to forget everything. I enclose a note which you must be delighted to have again in your possession. You see what risk you were running when you left it in your pocket? This restitution must convince you of my friendship." End of chapter 2.